They built cities before we built excuses. Stone temples, star calendars, sewer systems more advanced than some of ours today. Then one day gone, no war, no funeral, just silence. 30 civilizations, 30 disappearances. Not one satisfying answer. Some were erased by nature, others by neighbors. But most, they vanished into a fog thick enough to choke history itself. Welcome to the long, haunted road of ancient worlds that vanished overnight, where the only thing more disturbing than how they disappeared is how little we seem to care that they did. The Indus Valley Civilization. They built a civilization without violence. Think about that. In an age when neighboring empires measured greatness in blood and monument, they chose something else: cleanliness, symmetry, precision. Their streets were gridded, their bricks were standardized, their homes, many of them, not just the wealthy, had private toilets. Their wastewater drained into underground sewer systems better organized than some modern cities. This was 2600 BCE. The world was still trying to figure out the wheel, and here they were, flushing away their waste with a kind of quiet dignity that no one else on the planet seemed interested in copying. And then, without warning or fanfare, the Indus Valley Civilization disappeared. The rivers kept flowing, the land didn't vanish, but the cities? Empty. The script? Silent. The people? Gone, absorbed into other cultures or scattered by time. No smoking ruins. No mass graves. No last stands etched into stone. Just silence. A cultural fade-out so complete it borders on surreal. When Mohenjo-Daro was rediscovered in the 1920s, British archaeologists stood knee-deep in the remnants of an impossibly clean society and realized they'd unearthed a ghost with no motive. It wasn't a small civilization. At its height, it may have had 5 million people, spread across more than 1,000 settlements. Urban planning, sanitation, metallurgy, standardized weights and measures. They traded with Mesopotamia. Their seals have been found as far as Oman. But they never left behind epic poems about gods hurling thunderbolts. They didn't carve their victories into walls. They didn't seem to care if future civilizations remembered their names. That might be why we forgot them. This civilization did everything right. That's the eerie part. They avoided war, they elevated public health, and they left no trace of centralized authoritarian rule. No empires, no kings, no tombs full of gold. It's as if the entire society was designed by a committee of engineers with OCD and an allergy to narcissism. In most cities of the ancient world, power was vertical. In the Indus Valley, it was horizontal. You can see it in the layout. No palaces, no elite districts. Just urban egalitarianism, brick by brick. And yet, around 1900 BCE, something began to crack. The cities were gradually abandoned, populations dwindled, trade networks collapsed. The once orderly civilization unraveled. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either. A few generations maybe. Enough time for the last people in Mohenjo-Daro to wonder why the drains weren't being cleaned anymore. Why the granaries were half empty. Why the script no longer meant anything to anyone. We still don't know why it happened. Theories abound, of course. Climate change is a favorite, particularly the shifting of the monsoon patterns and the drying of the Sarasvati River, which may have been the lifeblood of the region. Some point to tectonic activity, earthquakes that altered the course of rivers and made once fertile land uninhabitable. Others suggest disease. Or the slow decay of a culture stretched too thin across too many cities without a strong central identity to hold it together. But these are just educated guesses. There are no tales of gods punishing the people for their sins, no murals of barbarians at the gates, no last letters home from dying outposts. The collapse left no story, and maybe that's the story. The Indus script remains undeciphered to this day. There are thousands of inscriptions, but they're all incredibly short, usually just a handful of symbols, seals used for trade, most likely, identifiers. But no Rosetta Stone has ever been found, no bilingual text to help us bridge the gap, and the symbols themselves don't look like anything we recognize. They're unique, entirely so. The more we study them, the more they refuse to open up. It's almost as if the Indus didn't want to be remembered. Or maybe the opposite is true, they wanted only their ideas to survive, not their egos, plumbing over poetry, sanitation over self-aggrandizement. They may have believed that a clean, orderly life was more important than having your name screamed into eternity by priests and scholars. If so, the joke's on them. Because history doesn't remember quiet competence, it remembers conquest. The civilizations that came after were louder, bloodier, more dramatic. The Aryans moved into the subcontinent with their Vedic rituals and horse chariots, bringing the fire and fury that the Indus seemed to have no interest in matching, and slowly, their memory was overwritten. Except not quite, because their cities remain silent, intact, and ghostly. Their sewers still run beneath ancient streets. Their bricks still fit together with machine-like precision. But their voices? Still lost. Theirs is a mystery that lingers not because of what we know, but because of how little we understand the things they didn't say. Maybe they really did vanish overnight. Not in the literal sense, but in the way memory collapses when there's no one left to tell your story. Maybe their collapse wasn't dramatic enough to make the cut in history's greatest hits. Maybe they were so advanced, so organized, so equitable, that they forgot to build monuments to themselves. And history punishes those who fail to self-mythologize. We remember empires that shouted. We forget the ones that whispered. And speaking of whispers, there's another ghost city, half buried in desert stone. Not as ancient, but just as impossible. A city carved into the red cliffs of southern Jordan. The kind of place that looks like it was built for an audience that never arrived. Columns and facades chiseled out of mountainsides, as if gods needed architecture to make a point. The Nabateans built Petra not just to be seen, but to disappear into legend. They didn't just vanish, they left the lights on. And no one knows why. The Nabateans. The first time you see Petra, it feels like a special effect. There's a slit in the desert, a narrow passage through rose-colored cliffs called the Sick. It snakes through the sandstone for nearly a mile, twisting, narrowing, closing in. The walls tower above you, wind-smoothed and sun-scorched. The shadows deepen. Then suddenly, the passage opens, and there it is. The treasury, Al-Khazne. A 40-meter-high Greco-Roman facade carved directly into the rock face, columns and all, like some divine architect got bored of building things on flat ground. It looks impossible. It is impossible, but it's real, and for a long time, people assumed it must have been a tomb, because who carves something this grand if not to bury a king? But no king has ever been found inside. In fact, no one has. That's the Nabateans for you, genius architects of absence, the people who left behind everything but themselves. For centuries, Petra was a legend, the kind of place only nomads whispered about and cartographers drew in the blank spots of maps. It wasn't officially discovered by the West until 1812, when a Swiss explorer dressed up as an Arab pilgrim and tricked his Bedouin guide into taking him there. What he found wasn't just a city. It was a performance frozen in time. Temples, tombs, staircases to nowhere, an entire amphitheater carved from stone, but no houses, no royal palace, no throne room, no historical documents. Just elaborate facades, shrines, and architectural riddles. The Nabateans had vanished, and they had the audacity to leave their stage set up like the show could resume at any moment. Who were they? That's the hard part. Their origin story is slippery. They show up in the historical records sometime around the 4th century BCE, nomadic Arabs who somehow managed to control one of the most vital trade routes in the ancient world. Frankincense, myrrh, silk, spices, they controlled the flow of wealth through the desert, and they made Petra into a desert fortress of illusion. They were merchants, engineers, artists, and illusionists. They spoke a dialect of Aramaic, borrowed architecture from the Greeks and Romans, buried their dead with a unique blend of pagan and possibly proto-monotheistic symbols. They collected cultural aesthetics like trophies, but never let anyone truly inside. What made Petra so remarkable wasn't just the stonework, it was the hydraulics. Petra exists in one of the most arid regions on Earth. Rainfall is scarce, and yet, the Nabateans engineered a system of dams, cisterns, aqueducts, and water channels that allowed the city to flourish year-round. They didn't just survive the desert, they manipulated it. They mastered flash floods, carving water channels to redirect seasonal torrents into underground storage. Every drop of water was accounted for, collected, purified, and rationed. They could support 30,000 people in a place where life shouldn't have been possible. They had wealth, trade, cultural flexibility, religious ambiguity, and water. In the ancient world, that's like holding a royal flush. So what happened? No one knows. That's the magic trick. By the 4th century CE, Petra was a ghost. Rome had annexed the Nabatean kingdom a few centuries earlier, but the city kept functioning for a while. And then, it didn't. The trade routes shifted. Sea trade began to eclipse overland caravans. A few earthquakes did damage. Some say Christianity swept in and dried out the Nabatean religion, repurposing their temples into churches. Some say they were absorbed into Rome. Others say they simply moved on, dissolving into the sands like their origins. There was no climactic fall, no dramatic invasion. The Nabateans simply ceased to be visible. And it's that invisibility that makes them linger in our imagination. The treasury has bullet marks from when 19th century Bedouins tried to shoot treasure out of it thinking it must hold ancient riches. Petra was a city designed to provoke curiosity. It dares you to dig. But no matter how many layers you peel back, the people are gone. The everyday lives, the personal stories, the names of the architects wiped clean. We can guess, we can reconstruct. But the Nabateans themselves? They're a rumor fossilized in stone. They were so good at disappearing, even their language left almost nothing behind. They had inscriptions, sure mostly tomb markers and dedications, but no literature, no laws, no codex. Just enough Aramaic letters chiseled into a rock here and there to confirm they were real, and just clever enough to frustrate scholars for 2 centuries. Historians hate them, artists adore them, tourists Instagram them, but no one knows them. Because the Nabateans weren't just trading spices, they were trading absence. They built a city that would outlive memory but refused to explain itself. Petra was their punchline. The final, exquisite misdirection. Some civilizations burn bright, then go out, others collapse in chaos. The Nabateans, they left a masterpiece, turned off the lights, and exited stage left without a word. And maybe that was the point. Maybe Petra was never a home, maybe it was a performance, a mirage so intricate we still can't decide if it was ever real. Or maybe it was both a place to live and a mask to wear. A civilization that understood something no one else did. That the desert forgets you unless you give it a reason not to. And speaking of deserts, if you shift the map a few thousand miles east and a few thousand years earlier, you'll find a mystery even older, even stranger. A civilization buried under the soil of Nigeria, whose only surviving traces are eerie terracotta heads with alien expressions. They had no writing, no architecture, no empire. Just art, and then oblivion. The Nok culture. Before the pyramids rose, before Rome laid a single stone, before Confucius philosophized or the Bible had a name, there were faces staring out from the heart of what is now Nigeria. Elongated skulls, almond-shaped eyes, flared nostrils, high cheekbones. Some wore elaborate headdresses, some rode on horseback. Some sat with frozen expressions, dignified or disoriented depending on how long you stare. They were sculpted in terracotta, fired over 2,000 years ago, and buried beneath the earth like they were hiding from someone. And we didn't even know they existed until 1928, when a Nigerian tin miner stumbled across a head in the soil and shrugged it off. He wasn't looking for ancient art, he was looking for ore. But the British colonial authorities took notice, and soon the heads began to trickle into museums, private collections, and academic curiosity. What they found was staggering. Not one or two statues, hundreds. A lost civilization named Nok. Except, we don't know if that's what they called themselves. We only use the name because it's the name of a modern Nigerian village near where the first sculptures were found. What we know, what we think we know, is this. The Nok culture flourished between 1500 BCE and 300 CE, making it one of sub-Saharan Africa's earliest known complex societies. They were among the first people in West Africa to smelt iron. Their sculptures show an astonishing level of artistic sophistication, stylized, yet intricate, symbolic, yet hauntingly expressive. These weren't idle decorations, they meant something. They represented something. Or someone. But what? We don't know, because the Nok didn't leave any writing. No cities, no temples, no tombs, just the sculptures. And even those have been plundered, scattered, and looted so thoroughly that context is impossible to recover. Most of the heads and figures have no archaeological provenance. They were unearthed by miners, trafficked by smugglers, auctioned by the greedy, and admired by the clueless. By the time academics were brought in to ask questions, the answers had already been stolen and sold. So all we're left with are the faces. And that's where things get weirder. Some figures look ceremonial, others seem personal. A few are deeply unsettling. There's a recurring theme of elongated heads, some naturally styled, others seemingly unnatural. A handful wear what appear to be armor or weaponry, though there's no direct evidence Nok culture ever waged organized war. There's a rider on horseback, sculpted centuries before the earliest known introduction of the horse into that region of Africa. That's not just an anachronism, it's a paradox. Were they part of a broader, forgotten cultural web? Were they traders? Did they travel, exchange ideas, technologies? Or were they isolated visionaries, developing iron smelting and sculptural realism in a vacuum? You can't help but look into those eyes and wonder, who taught you to see the human face like this? Most early art, pre-modern, prehistoric, even early classical, flattens the human form, idealizes it, turns it into symbol or silhouette. But the Nok gave us personality. Their sculptures don't just represent people, they interpret them. Exaggerated brows, complex hairstyles, asymmetry. These aren't gods, they're not ideals, they're individuals. So how did a culture with no known cities, no writing, no temples, and no infrastructure develop art so advanced that it wouldn't look out of place next to Roman busts or Khmer statues? And why did they disappear? The standard explanation, always ready, always Vegas: environmental collapse, soil degradation, deforestation, maybe overuse of firewood to fuel iron furnaces led to unsustainable ecological decline. Maybe the population thinned, maybe they migrated, fragmented into smaller ethnic groups, lost cultural continuity, forgot who they were. But maybe it's something more disturbing. Maybe they were never meant to last. The Nok didn't leave behind legacy. They didn't build empires. They didn't name kings. If they had a political structure, it's invisible to us now. Their sculptures seem more concerned with memory than myth. More private than public. Maybe these were grave markers, or ancestor effigies. Maybe each head was a story, a secret, a warning. Or maybe they were masks, clay masks, pretending to be human faces, pretending to be gods, pretending to be us. And then they were buried. Was that ritual? Was it reverence? Or was it fear? There's something deeply uncanny about these figures. The way they hold your gaze, the way they tilt their heads, as if listening, as if they know you're looking. You don't get that from stylized art. You get that from memory. These sculptures don't feel made for public display. they feel made for the dead. Or for someone watching us from the other side. When cultures disappear, they usually leave behind debris, cities, writing, corpses, but the knock left art and silence. It's not just that we don't know what happened to them, it's that we never really knew they were there. Entire centuries of African history exist in blank space. And into that space, we pour guesswork and projection. But the knock don't play along. They don't offer narrative, they don't allow timeline, they don't even apologize for the confusion, they just stare, quietly, patiently, as if waiting for us to remember a language we never spoke. What we do know is this: someone once walked the valleys of Nigeria with clay in their hands and visions in their mind. Someone sculpted what they swore, what they feared. They fired it, buried it, and left it for us. And what we found wasn't myth or monument, it was identity. And then, that identity shattered. Today, many knock pieces remain locked in private collections, their origins unknown, their meanings guessed at. Nigeria continues to battle the legacy of colonial looting. Some pieces have returned home. Many haven't. But even the ones on display, even the ones studied and cleaned and cataloged, they don't explain themselves. They weren't meant to. The knock culture reminds us that the deepest mysteries aren't always buried under grand cities or entombed in gold. Sometimes they're right underfoot, watching us, daring us to make sense of them. And sometimes the silence isn't a void, it's a defense, a way of keeping the past from being devoured by the present. But let's stay in Africa a little longer. Further east, high in the Ethiopian highlands, another ancient mystery is waiting. A civilization that carved stelae to reach the heavens, that traded with Rome, that minted its own coins, that built monumental obelisks and allegedly held the Ark of the Covenant, and then disappeared into the fog of conquest and conversion. The kingdom of Aksum, powerful, rich, advanced, and now just a shadow etched into stone. The Aksumite Empire. History rarely puts Ethiopia where it belongs. The maps lie, the timelines cheat, the textbooks skim over it. Because buried in the highlands of East Africa is a civilization that could rival Rome, trade with India, stand eye to eye with Persia, and still had time to claim it was guarding the literal Ark of the Covenant. The Aksumite Empire, a kingdom that minted its own coins, carved its own script, and built a legacy in stone. And yet today, most people couldn't tell you where Aksum was, let alone why it vanished. That's the thing about ancient African empires. They don't get to collapse in dramatic fashion like Rome, they just fade. The camera pans away, and when it pans back, they're gone. But for 6 centuries, Aksum was one of the great powers of the ancient world. At its height roughly from the 1st to the 7th century, CE controlled much of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, touched parts of Sudan, Yemen, even dipped its fingers into Arabia. It sat at the crossroads of 3 continents, and it knew it. They weren't a mystery then. The Persians knew them, the Byzantines knew them, the Romans respected them. In the 4th century CE, the Persian prophet Mani ranked Aksum alongside Rome, China, and Persia as one of the 4 great kingdoms of his time. Imagine being part of the Big Four and still getting edited out of history class. They spoke Ge'ez, a language still used in Ethiopian liturgy today. They developed a written script. They built monumental stelae towering granite obelisks, carved and transported without modern tools, some over 30 meters high. These weren't just grave markers, they were architectural flexes. Giant stone skyscrapers for the dead. And Aksum had something else, something Rome didn't. They had faith, not just the abstract kind, the kind with mythic weight. Because according to Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Ark of the Covenant, the actual Old Testament, 10 Commandments holding, "Smite you if you touch it," Ark is housed in Aksum to this day. In a small, heavily guarded chapel called the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, watched over by a single monk who can never leave, never speak to outsiders, and will die with the secret: no photos. No carbon dating, no public viewings, just a claim wrapped in centuries of silence and just enough paranoia to make it feel more real. Is the Ark there? Probably not, but the belief is, and belief, when it stretches long enough across time, becomes a kind of artifact in itself. You don't need to see the Ark to feel its presence in Aksum's story. The power of that legend helped shape Ethiopian identity. It gave divine legitimacy to kings, inspired holy wars, and made Aksum not just a player in the ancient world, but a sacred one. Which makes its disappearance even more haunting. There's no single cause we can point to, no fireball in the sky, no last emperor betrayed by his senate. What happened to Aksum is the same thing that happens to so many great powers. The ground shifted beneath it, slowly, like a tide receding from a beach it had once claimed. Climate change played its part. The land dried. The Red Sea's shifting trade winds made Aksum's ports less strategic. As Islam rose in the 7th century, it reshaped the map of faith and commerce. The Arabian Peninsula, once part of Aksum's extended influence, became an enemy frontier. Trade routes that once brought wealth and exotic goods began to bypass Aksum. Drought, deforestation, and soil erosion further weakened the empire's core. But none of this felt sudden. That's the uncanny part. Aksum didn't fall, it receded. It moved. It transformed. The royal court relocated southward into the highlands, where new dynasties and Christian monarchies would take root, eventually evolving into the Ethiopian Empire. The identity changed, but the bones remained. The churches of Lalibelethos, miraculous, sunken sanctuaries, carved directly into Rakare Aksum's spiritual children. The Solomonic dynasty, which claimed descent from the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Also born from Aksumite myth, the Ark legend didn't vanish, it deepened. It became national DNA. And yet, the empire itself, the bureaucracy, the coinage, the seaports, the international diplomacy crumbled into dust. Aksum's fall is a paradox, a collapse that wasn't a collapse. It's a shadow that moved faster than the eye could track. One day it was a world power, the next, a holy rumor. The stones still stood, but the empire they anchored had already turned into legend. And what about those coins? That's where it gets even stranger. Aksum was one of the first African kingdoms to mint its own coinage, complete with inscriptions in Greek. They featured kings, crosses, and a steady evolution from pagan symbols to Christian ones as the empire converted to Christianity in the 4th century, making it one of the earliest nations to do so. Even Rome didn't officially convert until Constantine. Those coins were real, tangible proof that Aksum wasn't just participating in global commerce, it was shaping it. You don't print your face on metal unless you expect people to respect the weight of your words. And then, they stopped minting. The coins dried up. The Greek faded. The international prestige disintegrated like a dried leaf in a desert wind. Some ruins remain. The stelae still stab the sky. A few underground tombs have been excavated. Pottery, tools, echoes, but no final act, no written account of a last stand, no climactic fall. Just silence, once again. Silence and faith. Because Aksum didn't die in fire or fury, it dissolved into legend. It became a sacred absence, a myth wrapped in granite, a ghost empire whose remnants still pulse beneath the soil of Ethiopia. Which brings us to something even older, even quieter. A place where the first temple may have been built not to worship but to remember. A place so ancient, it predates writing, agriculture, and possibly even myth. A site buried deliberately, as if someone was trying to erase not a culture, but the memory of what it knew. A hill in southeastern Turkey, a circle of megaliths older than Stonehenge. Carvings of animals, no burials, no homes, no script. Just pillars. And a question. Göbekli Tepe. In the beginning, there was the hill, just a hump in the dry Turkish countryside, near the Syrian border, overgrown with brush, covered in rocks, indistinct and unspectacular. For centuries, farmers thought it was just that, a hill. Nothing worth remembering. They plowed their fields, grazed their animals, and let time move on. And then, in 1994, a Kurdish shepherd stumbled on something buried just beneath the soil, a carved stone, sticking out of the ground like the finger of a giant trying to claw its way back into history. Archaeologists came, they dug, and what they found cracked open the entire story of civilization. Göbekli Tepe. A site so ancient, it predates the pyramids by 7,000 years. Older than Stonehenge, older than agriculture, older than writing. A site that should not exist. Because, according to everything we thought we knew, hunter-gatherers weren't supposed to build temples. They weren't supposed to carve multi-ton pillars and arrange them in circular enclosures. They weren't supposed to organize large-scale construction projects. They were supposed to be too busy chasing game and dodging predators. And yet, here it is. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular formations up to 30 meters across. Many are elaborately carved with reliefs of animal snakes, lions, boars, birds, scorpions. Some have abstract symbols. Others have eerily humanoid features, arms, fingers, even belts and loincloths. These weren't just rocks, they were statements. They were stories in stone, told in a language no one speaks anymore. And here's the part that makes it stranger. They buried it. Yes, they built this mind-bending complex and then, deliberately, methodically, they buried it under tons of backfill. Not destroyed, not abandoned, buried like a secret. Like something that had to be forgotten. Why? No one knows. But it messes with our timeline in a way that's hard to overstate. Göbekli Tepe dates back to around 9,600 BCE. That's before pottery, before metal tools, before villages. The people who built it were still supposed to be hunter-gatherers, nomads. They weren't even supposed to know how to organize. But somehow, they did. And that's the paradox. They built a temple before they built cities. They created religion before they created civilization. We've long assumed the sequence went like this: agriculture, surplus, cities, religion. You settle down, plant some wheat, generate extra food, build a town, then invent God to explain why things go wrong. But Göbekli Tepe flips that. It suggests maybe religion came first. Maybe the need to gather and worship or remember was the catalyst for everything else. Maybe people came together not for food, but for ritual. Maybe belief is what domesticated us. And then, for reasons we'll never fully understand, they chose to forget it. Because this wasn't a one-time structure. Over centuries, new enclosures were built atop the old ones. The site evolved, layered itself like sediment. But eventually, it was entombed by its own makers, sealed, preserved, hidden, a conscious act of cultural amnesia. Some say it was ritual closure, a spiritual reboot. Others speculate that the society that built it fell apart, and the burial was an effort to erase what came before to deny its memory power. And let's not ignore the carvings. They're not just decorative, they're symbolic. Predators, vultures, scorpions, reptilian creatures. This isn't a place you go to celebrate the harvest. This is a place you go to remember what hunts you. Maybe it was a shrine to fear. Or a mausoleum for knowledge. Or a cosmic map. One controversial theory ties the layout of the animal symbols to constellations' early attempt at recording celestial events. Others claim the site is an archive of a cataclysm, possibly a comet impact around 10,900 BCE that triggered a mini ice age and erased an earlier chapter of humanity. It's speculation, of course, but the absence of answers is part of what makes Göbekli Tepe so seductive. The site itself is still only partially excavated. Radar scans suggest that 90% of it remains underground. What we've seen so far may just be the first page of a book we don't know how to read. And here's the other thing. they weren't alone. Other sites nearby Karahantepe, Navalu Chorisho, similar architecture, similar carvings. This wasn't a one-off fluke, it was part of a culture. One that somehow sprang into being after the last ice age, built the most advanced religious complex of its time, and then was swallowed by history. No writing, no known names, no myths that made it through, just the stones. And even those aren't trying to tell us anything comforting. There are no gods here, no saints, no prophets or peace. The animals carved into the pillars are not docile, they're wild, aggressive, alien. They look out at us with blank hostility. Or worse, they don't notice us at all. Göbekli Tepe doesn't feel like it was made for humans. It feels like it was made about humans. And then erased. You can't visit it without wondering, what else have we forgotten? What other truths were buried before we ever knew they were truths? What if the beginning of civilization isn't where we think it is? What if it's much older, and we've just been digging in the wrong direction? The builders of Göbekli Tepe didn't leave behind any declarations, no royal tombs, no manifestos, just a question in stone. Why do we remember some things and bury others? And that brings us to another buried question. A people who built towers all over an island, left no written history, and vanished so cleanly, they might as well have stepped through a portal. Sardinia's Nuragic civilization. Mysterious towers called Nuragi, 8,000 of them, scattered like stone mushrooms across the landscape, with no real explanation. Who were they? Why towers? Why so many? And where did they go? The Nuragic civilization. If you fly over Sardinia at dawn low enough, quiet enough, you'll see them. Ancient stone towers, dotting the rugged landscape like broken chess pieces abandoned by gods who lost interest in the game. There are over 8,000 of them, round, hulking, megalithic structures called nuragi, each one standing watch over a hilltop, a valley, or the coastline. No two are exactly the same. And no one knows exactly why they were built. Even stranger, we don't know who built them either. The Nuragic civilization existed for nearly 2,000 years, from roughly 1,800 BCE to 500 BCE, and yet left behind no writing, no manifestos, no inscriptions to declare their victories or justify their architecture, just the tower cyclopean, silent and stubbornly immovable. They are, in every sense, unsolved. The name Nuragic is modern, drawn from the structures themselves. We call them Nuragi. They never told us what they called themselves. No kings, no conquests, just stones and shadows. Each nurag is built in the shape of a truncated cone, with thick dry stone walls and an interior chamber that spirals upward. Many are solitary, others are surrounded by small villages, wells, temples, and megalithic tombs. The largest, like Su Nuraxi at Baruminihav, multiple towers, connected by corridors and defensive walls. Some even have spiral staircases built within the stone. They look like fortresses, but also like observatories, shrines, beacons, time machines built out of ignorance and ambition. What were they for? That's the problem. No one agrees. Some archaeologists argue they were defensive towers built for war, for surveillance, for show-of-force posturing. Others see them as religious centers, symbolic rather than strategic, with their elevated designs pointing to a reverence for the sky. Still others think they were status symbol stone displays of tribal prestige, a prehistoric arms race in architecture. But those are theories, and the Nuragic people aren't here to confirm or deny any of them. What we do know is that they were builders. Stubborn, detail-obsessed, stone-dragging visionaries who managed to construct some of the most complex megalithic structures in Europe without the wheel, without written blueprints, and without the desperate need for posthumous fame that most ancient cultures had. No empires, no golden idols, no mythologized hero kings. Just towers. And then, silence. The decline of the Nuragic civilization is as opaque as its origins. There's no single moment of collapse, no apocalyptic battle, no sudden disappearance. Just a slow fading of complexity, a scattering of stones, a cultural disintegration that no one seemed interested in recording. By the time the Phoenicians began trading along Sardinia's coasts, the Nuragic people were already starting to vanish. By the time Rome arrived, the towers were ruins. Some theorize they were conquered, gradually absorbed by waves of foreign settlers. Others think the social systems that supported Nuragi building simply collapsed under the weight of internal conflict, resource scarcity, or ecological change. But maybe it wasn't a collapse at all. Maybe they chose to vanish. There's a certain kind of resistance built into the Nuragic world in anonymity that feels deliberate. They weren't trying to make history, they were trying to make something else, something more permanent. Stone is harder to erase than language. And yet, what's more permanent than stone? For all their mass, all their might, the Nuragi tell us almost nothing. They don't explain themselves. They don't ask to be remembered. They just stand there, year after year, absorbing sun and storm, waiting for someone to understand why they were built. There's something eerie about a people who left behind thousands of towers but no names. It's almost as if they knew we'd be looking. Some of the towers align with celestial events, some face the solstice, others point toward the sea. There are theories, of course that they functioned as a giant network, like a prehistoric communications grid, that signal smoke, fire, horns could be passed from tower to tower across the island. A Stone Age internet, a web of light and message stretching over centuries. And if that's true, then the towers weren't just structures, they were voices, part of a conversation we can no longer hear. So why build a civilization around towers? Because towers watch, towers remember, they hold the high ground, literally and symbolically. To build a tower is to declare that what's above is as important as what's below. Maybe the Nuragic people believed the gods lived in the sky, or maybe they feared what was coming from it. Maybe they were reaching toward something, or guarding against it. But without writing, everything becomes speculation. We excavate the sites, we catalog the pottery, we carbon date the charcoal in their hearths, but none of it tells us what they felt about their world. And feelings, fear, awe, pride, guilt, those are the parts that make a people real. All we have are the stones. And yet, those stones haunt. They seem like more than relics, they seem like witnesses, like the island itself remembers what we've forgotten. Even the Sardinians aren't entirely sure what to make of their ancestors. The Nuragi are part of the national identity, but they're also a puzzle that no one's quite solved. The tourism brochures celebrate the mystery. The museums try to decode it, but the truth is simpler and more terrifying. We don't understand them. We never understood them. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the Nuragic people were never trying to be known. Maybe they built their towers to watch us fail at understanding. Maybe they believed that permanence wasn't about telling your story, it was about outlasting everyone else's. And speaking of the silence of stone, let's move to another ancient mystery. One not carved into hills, but lost in rivers. A civilization so old it makes history blur at the edges. They built a vast network of cities, then deliberately burned them down over and over again. They had pottery more refined than the Greeks, but no known system of writing. Their settlements housed tens of thousands. Then, nothing. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture. They didn't collapse, they erased themselves. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture. Imagine a civilization that lasted for nearly 3,000 years longer than ancient Egypt, longer than Rome. A culture that stretched across the river valleys of modern-day Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. A culture that built settlements so massive, they wouldn't be matched in scale again until the rise of Mesopotamian city-states. And then they burned it all down, not once, repeatedly. Not in war, not by accident. On purpose. Welcome to the haunting riddle of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, a prehistoric enigma that flourished from around 5400 BCE to 2700 BCE. They lived in circular villages, some housing 10,000 to 15,000 people, insanely large for the Neolithic era. They cultivated wheat and barley, domesticated cattle and pigs, and spun textiles from flax. Their pottery was ornate, painted in hypnotic spirals and abstract geometric patterns. And then, every few decades, they would torch their settlements to the ground and start over. Deliberate arson as tradition. Why? No one knows. The prevailing theory that they did it ritually, cyclically, intentionally, isn't just speculative. It's supported by consistent archaeological evidence: layers of ash, collapsed walls, fire-reddened clay floors, whole houses burned while still stocked with tools, pottery, food. These weren't abandoned ruins later set ablaze by enemies or decay. These were homes turned into bonfires at the height of their usefulness. And they did it for centuries. It was as if their cities were designed to self-destruct, like the culture had hardwired collapse into its operating system. We call them cities, but they weren't cities in the modern sense. The Cucuteni Tripilia didn't build walls. There's no evidence of militarism, no weapons caches, no fortifications. Their settlements were circular, with homes arranged concentrically almost like mandalas or symbolic maps of the cosmos. They lived in peace, or something close to it, for millennia. And still, they burned their world. Maybe it was a form of purification, a way to cleanse the land, the air, the memory of whatever accumulated during their decades of habitation. Maybe they believed that the energy of a home had to be released like smoke to avoid stagnation, spiritual or otherwise. Maybe the destruction wasn't collapse, it was completion, a ritual reset. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't ritual at all. Maybe it was fear. There's another theory, darker and more unsettling, one that suggests the fires were an act of desperation, not ceremony, that the land couldn't support such massive, sustained settlements. That farming exhausted the soil, that disease spread, that internal tensions boiled over, and that fire was the last resort, the one thing that allowed them to reclaim control. Not just over their environment, but over the narrative of their own end. Burn it before it rots, erase it before it shames you. The most disorienting part is how long they lasted. Cultures that burn down their homes don't typically last 3,000 years. They disappear in decades. But the Cucuteni Tripilia people were resilient in a way we don't understand. Their pottery evolved, their settlements expanded, they traded with neighbors, they adapted. And then, just like that, they were gone. Sometime around 2700 BCE, their enormous settlements began to vanish from the archaeological record. The fires stopped, but so did everything else. It wasn't a dramatic end. There's no record of invasion, no mass graves, no trauma signatures, just a cultural exhale, a gradual fade. We don't know what happened. Did they migrate, assimilate, get absorbed by Indo-European tribes moving in from the steppe? Were they culturally erased, reduced to a whisper in someone else's mythology? Or did they do what they'd always done, torch the past, and walk away? The pottery is what remains. Thousands of fragments scattered across fields and dig sites, swirling patterns in red, black, and white, each line seemingly designed to hypnotize. It's tempting to see them as symbols, proto-writing, a language that never made it to the phonetic stage. But if that's true, we've never been able to decode it. The spirals remain just that, spirals. As if they were telling us that history doesn't move in a straight line, that sometimes civilization curls in on itself, that progress is a fire you tend carefully, or watch consume you. Some archaeologists believe the Tripilia proto-cities were a kind of cultural experimenta, utopian arrangement, never repeated, communal, egalitarian, unmilitarized. If so, the experiment lasted longer than most modern states, but it ended all the same. and we still don't know whether to read that as failure or success. Maybe they were never trying to advance. Maybe their cyclical lifestyle wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Maybe they burned their homes to remind themselves that nothing was permanent. That even the best designed world must one day become ash. They didn't build pyramids, they didn't write epics, they didn't make statues of themselves. They built homes, then lit matches. A culture of fire and forgetting. And in doing so, they left us with the oldest philosophical question of all. If you know something won't last, do you build it anyway? And now, let's turn to a different kind of disappearance. South of where the Tripilia people once lived, along the dusty plains of what is now southern Spain, lay another lost world. One with gold, ships, and an impossible language. A civilization said to be rich beyond measure. Its name flickers like a dream across Greek texts. Some think it was a myth, others think it was Atlantis. But there was a name, Tartessos. A land that glittered, then drowned. The Tartessians. Somewhere in the marshlands where the Guadalquivir River kisses the Atlantic, beneath layers of silt and centuries of silence, lies a city that may have once gleamed like a mirage. A place whispered about by the Greeks, envied by the Phoenicians, and ignored by the passage of time. Its people spoke a language no one could understand. They mined gold and silver from the mountains, and built ships that crossed the seas before most of Europe had figured out how to carve a decent canoe. They were the Tartessians. And they vanished. Completely. Tartessos is one of those civilizations that shouldn't be mysterious. It was wealthy, advanced, extensively written about by outsiders. Herodotus spoke of a king named Argantonios, who ruled Tartessos for 80 years and welcomed Greek travelers like a Mediterranean Gatsby. The Greeks described it as a land flowing with metal, culture, and grace. And yet, not one definitive Tartessian city has ever been found. Not one native text deciphered. Not one clear record of why or how they disappeared. It's as if they were written out of history just as quickly as they entered it. Tartessos existed roughly between 1200 BCE and 500 BCE, located in the southwestern Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Andalusia. Positioned at the edge of the known world, they became intermediaries between the Mediterranean civilizations and the Atlantic unknown. They were traders, miners, metallurgists. The region's mineral wealth was absurd, silver in particular, pulled from the Sierra Morena in such quantities that the Greeks romanticized the land as a kind of golden Eden. And yet, for a land so rich, Tartessos left behind so little. What we do have are tantalizing scraps, inscriptions in a language that appears to be neither Indo-European nor Semitic, still undeciphered. Artifacts that blend local Iberian styles with Eastern Mediterranean influences. Elite tombs like those found in the necropolis at Lojoya, filled with ivory, gold, and imported luxury goods, proof that the Tartessians were plugged into the broader ancient economy. They weren't isolated. They were essential. So what happened? The mystery thickens around 500 BCE. That's when the Tartessian culture disappears from the archaeological record. Not declines, not fades, disappears. The coins stop, the inscriptions stop. The trade goods stop. It's like a plug was pulled and the cultural lights went out. Some suggest a familiar culprit, Carthage. The Carthaginians, rising in power and influence along the North African coast, were expanding their grip on Western Mediterranean trade. There's speculation they may have launched a brutal campaign against Tartessos, seeking to control its mineral wealth and neutralize a strategic competitor. Some believe the Carthaginians didn't just conquer Tartessos, they erased it, burned the archives, killed the priests, salted the ground. The kind of imperial sanitization that leaves no witnesses and fewer clues. But that's a theory, a seductive one. No bodies, no battlefields, no clear signs of siege or resistance have been found. Others argue for environmental reasons, the Guadalquivir's shifting course, silting up of harbors, flooding of low-lying settlements. overmining and ecological degradation, a slow strangling of economic viability. If your wealth comes from what's underground and the ground stops cooperating, the empire doesn't scream, it just stops breathing. Then there are the mythologizers. The ones who point to the Greek connection and whisper, Atlantis. After all, Plato described a rich civilization beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. A kingdom blessed with resources, destroyed in a day and a night. Is it coincidence that Tartessos sat exactly where Plato described Atlantis? Probably. But Atlantis isn't really about a location, it's about a feeling. The feeling of something great being swallowed. And Tartessos was swallowed. Whether by war, water, or memory, it drowned in a silence so complete it might as well have never existed. Except, it did. We know it did. Herodotus wasn't hallucinating. The gold didn't mine itself. The hybrid culture of later Iberians didn't spring from nothing. Tartessos left fingerprints, just not a face. We're left with fragments, bronze plaques with strange scripts, burial treasures without names, foundations of buildings whose functions are guessed, not known. And the quiet frustration of a civilization that refuses to explain itself. What makes Tartessos so unsettling isn't that we don't know what happened, it's that we were so close to knowing. They touched the known world, they traded with literate people. They were known, and yet their own voice was somehow never recorded, or worse, deliberately silenced. There's a lesson buried in that mud, that being rich, famous, and culturally connected doesn't guarantee you a legacy. Sometimes history's tide just goes out and, if you're not tethered to something permanent, you disappear. And there's something else too. The Tartessian script undeciphered to this day feels like a locked door. It taunts the archaeologist, it sneers at the linguist. It's a full language, a system of writing, used over centuries, and yet no Rosetta Stone has emerged. The Tartessians left a message, but they wrote it in a cipher that history forgot how to crack. Maybe it was phonetic, maybe it wasn't, maybe they encoded their myths and memories in a way that only made sense to them, or maybe it wasn't meant to be understood by outsiders. Maybe the language was sacred. Or secret. Or maybe, like so many lost peoples, they thought they had more time. It's the great irony of history. We often remember the loud, the violent, the conquerors and colonizers. But sometimes it's the quiet vanishings that haunt more deeply. Tartessos didn't go out in a blaze. It went out like a candle in the wind, sudden, unnoticed, and never relit. But not far from Tartessos, across the waters and deeper into the African interior, another mystery waits. A kingdom of stone, not built, but carved, towers rising from cliffs, mausoleums in the sky. A culture swallowed by jungle, swallowed by time, and nearly erased by colonizers who couldn't believe Africans could have built something so magnificent. The Chachapoya. The Cloud People. The Chachapoya. High in the mist-wrapped Andes, where clouds coil around cliffs like serpents and the jungle breathes secrets into stone, there once lived a people who built citadels in the sky. They didn't leave behind grand statues or endless rows of hieroglyphs. They didn't conquer empires, they didn't scream their story across history's walls. But they built cities on mountains no sane person should have climbed, stacked bones in cliffside mausoleums, and disappeared before the world even learned their name. They are called the Chachapoya, the Cloud People. And true to that name, they came from the clouds and vanished into them, leaving behind only the kind of questions that rattle louder in silence. The Chachapoya civilization occupied a region of the northern Andes in what is now Peru, a green world of towering ridges, vertical jungles, and constant, veiling mist. They thrived for centuries before the Inca arrived, likely from around 900 CE to the late 1400s. Sand in that time, they left behind something stranger than gold or written records: height. Cuelap is their masterpiece. Perched at 10,000 feet above sea level, it's a fortress city of over 400 circular stone houses encircled by massive wallsome sections rising 60 feet high. You don't build that for fun. You build that to be seen, or to be hidden, or, in the Chachapoya's case, both. From above, Cuelap looks like a ruin halfway between Machu Picchu and a hallucination. A skeleton city wrapped in moss and fog, its narrow entryways forcing visitors into single-file vulnerability. Was it defensive, ritualistic, a statement? No one knows. And that's the running theme here. We don't know much about the Chachapoya because nearly everything we know comes second-hand from the Inca, who conquered them in the late 15th century, and from the Spanish, who showed up right after that and burned the footnotes. By the time anyone thought to ask who these people were, they were already gone. What remains is bizarre and beautiful. High cliff tombs carved into vertical faces of rock, filled with mummies wrapped in fine textiles and laid in fetal positions as if returned to the womb of the mountain. Sarcophagi that look like humanoid figures perched in cracks hundreds of feet above the ground, peering out over the valleys like mournful gods. Why bury your dead where no one can reach them? Maybe to keep them safe, maybe to keep us safe, maybe they believed spirits needed the elevation to return to wherever they came from. But even in life, the Chachapoya seemed to prefer the edge. They didn't settle in valleys or on easy plains. They lived where the air thins, where the jungle climbs, where every stone has to be persuaded into place. Their cities were built less for comfort than for declaration. And yet they never declared much at all. No writing, no long epics, no monumental inscriptions. The Cloud People didn't leave behind history, they left architecture and ghosts. And the ghosts, predictably, refused to explain themselves. When the Incas absorbed the Chachapoya into their empire, they noted their light skin and tall stature, curious detail, often overinterpreted by the conspiracy-hungry. Some tried to paint the Chachapoya as ancient Europeans, Celts, even Atlanteans, all nonsense. The reality is more interesting. They were native Andeans who adapted to vertical living better than anyone else. Their biology evolved alongside the altitude. But their culture didn't survive contact. The Inca relocated them, broke them, repopulated their cities with loyalists. Then the Spanish arrived, and whatever fragments remained were lost to disease, forced conversion, and that brutal historical erasure Europeans performed so efficiently. There is no recorded rebellion, no preserved saga of defiance, just silence. And still Cuelap stands. The cliff tombs still perch above the valleys. The sarcophagi still leer from the stone. What kind of people build citadels among clouds? People with something to protect, or something to hide, or both. Recent excavations at Chachapoya sites have unearthed not just dwellings but ceremonial platforms, carved stones with abstract symbols, and signs of sophisticated agriculture. These weren't savages living on cliffs out of desperation. They were engineers, planners, builders of communities where gravity itself seemed optional. But again, why there? Some say the height gave them a strategic view of the valleys below. Others argue it was spiritual, closer to the sky, closer to the gods. Still others think it was about isolation. The higher you live, the harder you are to conquer. Except that didn't work. The Incas conquered them anyway. The Spanish finished the job. It's possible that Cuelap and the other mountaintop sites were last stands, final redoubts of a culture trying to hold on as the world closed in. But that theory only works if you believe the Chachapoya were clinging to power. Maybe they weren't. Maybe they knew their time was ending. Maybe their obsession with height was never about defense at all. Maybe it was about departure. The dead weren't buried in the ground. They were placed above the world, in unreachable niches, as if waiting for something to carry them home. The cities weren't shelters, they were launch pads. Thresholds between earth and sky. That's the kind of theory you can't prove, but when you stand among the fog-wrapped ruins of Cuelap, you don't feel like you're walking through a city. You feel like you're walking through a memory that hasn't decided whether to stay or go. And the most haunting part? We only rediscovered most of it in the 19th and 20th centuries. For hundreds of years, the Cloud People were barely even a rumor. Their names were erased, their mummies hidden, their temples grown over. If it weren't for a few stubborn archaeologists and the occasional landslide exposing a tomb, they'd still be invisible. And that brings us to another invisible civilization known, even older, even more obscured. A culture from prehistoric Nigeria that sculpted surreal terracotta heads with an almost modern sensibility, and then vanished without explanation. We've already met them once. But there's another African mystery waiting beyond Nok, a kingdom that once ruled the Sahel, one that dug underground tunnels to access hidden water, one that flourished in a place no one should have survived. Then it was consumed by sand, by empire, by time. The Garamantes. Picture the Sahara Desert not as it is now, but as it was once, a shifting expanse of rock and sand, blistering by day, freezing by night, as inhospitable to human ambition as the surface of Mars. A place where no civilization should thrive, a graveyard of heat and wind. Now imagine that under this hellscape, a kingdom flourished, underground, out of sight, out of reach, not myth, not mirage, real. The Garamantes. You've probably never heard of them. That's how they liked it. They lived where no one else dared to. And they engineered the impossible underground water system that kept an empire alive in the middle of the world's largest desert. Then, like so many others, they vanished, not with a scream, but with a shrug. The Garamantes rose to power in what is now southwest Libya, in the Fezzan region, known of the most brutal places on earth. They began as semi-nomadic pastoralists around 1000 BCE, but by the 5th century BCE, they had evolved into a complex society. They built towns, fortified settlements, necropolises. They farmed dates, wheat, barley, even grapes, all in the middle of a desert where rainfall is a rumor. How? They went underground. The Garamantes developed a system of Fogaras underground tunnels used to tap into ancient fossil water trapped beneath the desert. These channels, sometimes stretching for kilometers, allowed water to flow by gravity to their fields. It was quiet, ingenious, invisible. They built life where life shouldn't be, and they did it in secret. The Romans knew of them, barely. They show up in scattered texts. Herodotus called them a very great nation. Tacitus described them as elusive raiders. The Garamantes were known more for their speed than their substance. They rode chariots pulled by horses, across open sand, striking from nowhere, vanishing into heat. To the Romans, they were shadows on the horizon, ghosts with spears. But the truth was stranger. The Garamantes weren't just desert pirates. They were builders, traders, innovators. Archaeological digs in the Fezzan have uncovered multi-room houses, urban layouts, cemeteries, even what appears to be a palace. The capital, Garama, modern-day Jerma, may have housed 4,000 people with 6,000 more in surrounding settlements. That may sound small, but in the Sahara, that's a metropolis. And they weren't isolated. They traded across vast distances gold, salt, slaves, ivory, serving as middlemen between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. They weren't the end of the road. They were the artery. Then, sometime around the 5th century CE, they were gone. Not conquered, not memorialized, just gone. What happened? The usual suspects line up: climate change, overuse of resources, political fragmentation, Islam's expansion disrupting trade routes. But at the core of it all was their dependence on a resource that couldn't replenish: fossil water. Once the underground aquifers dried up, the fogaras failed, the fields went fallow, the people fled. Imagine a kingdom drinking itself out of existence one bucket at a time. There's something brutally poetic about that. The desert didn't kill the Garamantes. The desert waited, let them flourish, let them innovate, then reclaimed them. Today, the fogaras are mostly collapsed. The walls of Garama are sand-softened outlines. The stones whisper instead of speak. Satellite imagery has revealed the bones of their kingdom-forgotten fields, dead canals, tombs swallowed by dunes. Even their writing Tifinagh, the ancient Berber script, survives only in fragments, inscriptions on rocks, names without stories, a language that tells us they were literate, but not what they said. And yet, the Garamantes matter, because they represent something we pretend we've conquered: limits. Modernity teaches us that if we build clever enough systems, we can outwit geography. The Garamantes were proof of that, until they weren't. Until nature reminded them, and now, us, that engineering isn't immunity, that even the most ingenious solutions can run dry. We like to think of the desert as a place of emptiness. The Garamantes knew better. They filled it with life, quiet life, life beneath the surface, life that didn't need monuments or headlines. And maybe that's why they were forgotten. They didn't make a spectacle of themselves. They didn't broadcast their greatness. They survived by hiding. Until there was nothing left to hide from. And what's left now? Not much. Some pottery, stone tools, the remains of water channels, ruins half buried in the sand. There's no grand finale, no climactic fall, just evaporation, a slow fading. You could stand in the center of Garama today and never know you were in the heart of a kingdom. Unless you dig. And that's the recurring theme, isn't it? These civilizations that disappear, they don't always fall, they don't always die. Sometimes they just get buried, by time, by sand, by our obsession with bigger, louder, bloodier empires. But the silence matters. The Garamantes didn't write epics, they engineered survival. And when their survival failed, they didn't cry for help. They didn't demand remembrance, they simply stopped. And that leaves us with the image of a kingdom underground, not just in tunnels, but in memory. A people who once lived in the hollow places of the earth, now living in the hollow places of our history. But not every disappearance is slow. Some come like lightning, like betrayal, like a cosmic joke. Let's move now to the far reaches of the Mediterranean, where another civilization, famed for its art, architecture, and mystery, seemed poised to shape the ancient world. Then the sea turned against them, the earth shook, and their story ended in fire and ash. The Minoans. The people of the labyrinth. Of the bull. Of the great silence. The Minoans. You've seen the imagery, even if you didn't know what it was. A sinuous figure in a flowing robe, mid-leap, flipping over the back of a bull. Frescoes painted in colors that still look wet. Dolphins swimming across palace walls. Spirals, lilies, griffins. A world where myth wasn't decoration, it was design. Where art wasn't about conquest, it was about life. This was Minoan Crete. A civilization so sophisticated, so vibrant, so modern in its sensibilities that when it was first uncovered, scholars couldn't believe it was ancient. It looked too alive, too gentle. And then it was gone. Vanished like a stage play where all the actors forgot their lines, and the curtain never fell because no one remembered to lower it. The Minoans flourished on Crete for over 1,000 years, from around 2,700 BCE to 1,450 BCE. They weren't a small tribe huddled on a rock, they were a maritime powerhouse with a sprawling trade network, complex bureaucracy, and a cultural influence that stretched across the Aegean and beyond. Their cities were marvels: Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, labyrinthine layouts, sophisticated plumbing, multi-story buildings with light wells and ventilation shafts. Murals that celebrated nature, not warfare. And yet, they left behind no known monuments to military glory, no war propaganda, no records of conquest, just frescoes of dancing girls, fishermen, and religious rites. And a script-linear Athad we still can't read. It's hard to say whether the Minoans were peaceful or just unrecorded in their violence, but compared to their contemporaries, they seemed quieter, more playful, almost utopian. That's what makes their disappearance feel like a moral parable. Around 1450 BCE, something changed. The palaces were destroyed, not all at once, but in a rolling wave of collapse. Fires, ruins, abandonment. The art stopped. The writing stopped. And when the dust settled, the island didn't belong to the Minoans anymore. It belonged to the Mycenaeans. Now, here's where things get murky. Was it war? Maybe. Some think the Mycenaeans invaded and burned the palaces. Others say there's little evidence of direct conflict, that the Minoans were already weakened, and the Mycenaeans just filled a vacuum. Then there's the theory that refuses to go away: Thera. The volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Santorini, ancient Therae, estimated to have occurred around 1600 BCE. One of the largest eruptions in recorded history. It blew the island apart, sending tsunamis across the Aegean, and possibly triggering climate disruptions across the region. The Minoans weren't on Thera, but they traded with it, and they were close enough to suffer the aftershocks. A tsunami could have decimated their coastal cities. Ashfall could have poisoned their crops. The psychological impact alone, an entire island obliterated, might have shattered their religious or political order. But the timing doesn't quite line up. Thera exploded decades before the final destruction of the Minoan palaces. That's led some to argue that Thera was the beginning of the end, not the end itself. A cultural trauma so profound it started a slow unraveling: panic, decline, fragmentation, and eventually, collapse. If so, it was the cruelest kind of apocalypse, the kind that lets you linger, hollowed out, for just long enough to see yourself fade. And fade they did. By the time the Mycenaeans took over Crete, Minoan culture was already disintegrating. Linear A gave way to linear Ba script we can read, used by the Mycenaeans to record economic transactions, not myths. The frescoes changed, the language changed, the gods changed. The silence began. And here's the strangest part. The Minoans never told us their story, not really. We know them only through archaeology, through ruins and guesses. They didn't leave behind readable histories. They didn't mythologize their kings. They didn't even seem to care about being remembered. Or maybe they thought they would be remembered, that the vibrancy of their art, the rhythm of their rituals, the complexity of their architecture would speak for them forever. But history doesn't listen unless you shout. And the Minoans didn't shout, they sang, danced, painted, and then fell silent. The Greeks who came after remembered them only through myth: Daedalus and the labyrinth, Minos and the Minotaur, Ariadne and her thread, tales of half-human beasts, lost children, inescapable mazes. Those stories aren't historical accounts, they're echoes, dream versions of a people who left no message, only motifs. Knossos is often called the labyrinth, but it wasn't a maze. It was a palace multi-leveled, disorienting, alive with frescoes and columns painted blood red. The so-called throne room contains a stone seat barely wider than a child's shoulders. The throne of a king, or the seat of a priestess, a ritual object, a joke we were never meant to get? No one knows, because the people who could explain it never wrote it down, or if they did, they used a language the earth hasn't yet agreed to translate. What kind of civilization builds beauty, but not memory? What kind of people leaves behind murals of dolphins and flowers, but no tombs, no funerary pyramids, no cries for legacy? Maybe the Minoans believed that beauty was enough, that the gods saw, even if history didn't. Or maybe they thought they had more time. It's easy to mourn a civilization that dies in fire. It's harder to grieve one that fades with grace. The Minoans didn't rage, they didn't resist, they let go. And in letting go, they became a riddle wrapped in art. But let's follow that volcanic trail just a little farther. Because while the Minoans were vanishing in the eastern Mediterranean, another group of enigmatic seafarers was setting fire to the entire Bronze Age. A shadow army with no home, no face, no king. They attacked Egypt, they burned Troy. They brought apocalypse in their sails. No one knows where they came from. We just call them the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples. They came from nowhere. That's the part that keeps historians up at night. No warning, no declarations, no heralds announcing the dawn of a new power. Just ships, hundreds of them pulling up to the shores of the mightiest civilizations of the Late Bronze Age, carrying warriors with no fixed identity, no known language, no diplomatic envoy. And fire. They didn't conquer, they didn't occupy, they obliterated. Egypt called them the Sea Peoples. That's not a name, it's a shrug, a placeholder. A grim guess from pharaohs who couldn't explain why every one of their trade partners, neighbors, and tributaries was suddenly burning from the inside out. The Sea Peoples were not a single culture. They were a collapse in motion, a mobile catastrophe. They appeared around the 13th century BCE, and within a few short decades, ended the known world. No exaggeration, this wasn't just the fall of a few cities, this was the apocalypse of an age. Hatti, capital of the Hittite Empire, razed. Ugarit, a major trade hub, gone, letters still on the desks, asking for help. Mycenaean Greece burned, emptied, culture erased. Cyprus devastated. Canaan torched. Even mighty Egypt barely held them off, and only after multiple invasions. Pharaoh Ramesses III defeated them in a naval battle so vicious he had it carved into the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, along with images of the enemy, helmeted warriors, ox, drawn carts, families in tow. This wasn't just an army, it was a migration with teeth. Who were they? No one knows. And not in a fun, Indiana Jones way, truly, no one knows. Theories abound, all of them contradictory, all of them plausible, and all of them maddeningly incomplete. Some say they were displaced populations from the Aegean, refugees turned raiders after natural disasters and internal collapse. Others suggest they were mercenaries or former allies betrayed by the very empires they once served. There's evidence that parts of the group may have been from Sardinia, Sicily, even the Balkans. Egyptian records list their names: the Sherdun, the Shekelish, the Peliset, the Lukabut. Those are just sounds to us now, stripped of context, meaning nothing without maps that no longer exist. What united them wasn't culture, but momentum. They didn't settle lands, they erased them. They didn't send emissaries, they sent fire. Entire cities vanished from history during the period of their onslaught. Trade routes ended. Writing systems died. Languages disappeared, economies turned to dust. The Late Bronze Age world was a delicate machine, vast, interconnected, codependent. It was globalized in its way. Kings sent letters across continents. Merchants shipped tin and copper to make bronze. Palaces depended on distant resources. Empires were fragile, powerful, but fragile. And the Sea Peoples didn't just kick the machine, they dismantled it. What followed was centuries of darkness. No more trade, no more international diplomacy. The fall of Mycenae meant the Greeks had to start over. The collapse of the Hittites left a vacuum in Anatolia. The disintegration of Canaan opened the door for the rise of new powers, including Israel. The Sea Peoples didn't just end an age, they made the next one possible, through absence. And yet, for all their destruction, they left nothing behind. No monuments, no written language, no ruins of their own, only ruins of others. Their legacy is the charred silhouette of someone else's greatness. That's why they're a paradox. They were everywhere, and now they're nowhere. They haunt inscriptions, they live in the gaps between clay tablets, they echo in the emptiness of once great cities, but they themselves have no center, no origin story, no face. We remember them only because they ended the people we can remember. In that way, they're like an ancient algorithm of entropy, a correction, a reset button, a reminder that civilization is not a ladder, it's a circle, and sometimes it catches fire. The modern mind wants to understand them, to classify, to solve, but there's no solving the Sea Peoples. They were a force of historical entropy, not a puzzle with clean edges. Maybe they were a response to famine, drought, or climate change. Maybe they were the product of collapsed societies banding together in desperation. Or maybe they were just tired of being ruled and decided to see what would happen if they ended the game. Their legacy, if you can call it that, is a question. Can a people be remembered solely through the absence they leave behind? And speaking of absences, let's move from the sea to the highlands, to a kingdom that built a city of stones so massive and precisely fitted, they seemed to defy gravity and logic. A civilization that predates Inca grandeur, whose walls still stand in perfect silence. No mortar, no writing, no screams. Just fitted silence. They were called the builders of Sacsayhuaman. The unknown builders of Sacsayhuaman. There are walls that protect. There are walls that divide. And then there are walls that ask questions just by existing. Sacsayhuaman is one of those. High above the city of Cusco in Peru, where the air thins and time distorts, lies a fortress, or maybe not a fortress, built from stones so massive and precisely cut that they've become a kind of architectural riddle. They slot together without mortar, with seams so tight that modern engineers still struggle to explain how they were carved, moved, and placed. Some stones weigh more than 100 tons. The largest are taller than a man and shaped like irregular puzzle pieces. No two are the same, no repetition, no margin for error. The walls zigzag like a lightning bolt frozen in stone. They don't just hold ground, they hold memory. We credit the Inca. That's the default. The Inca ruled the region before the Spanish arrived. But even the Inca, when asked how these walls were made, pointed backward. To a time before them. To someone else? They inherited the stones, they didn't claim to have placed them. And that's where the mystery begins. Because the Inca built a lot roads, temples, administrative centers, but nothing quite like this. Nothing with this scale of precision, nothing with stones this big. You don't lift a 100-ton boulder and shape it to fit its neighbors like a glove without serious technology, or an incredible amount of time and labor, or both. So who built Sacsayhuaman? We don't know. And we're not even sure when. The structure is so complex and the archaeological evidence so sparse that it's impossible to date precisely. Some estimates place its origins as early as 1100 CE. Others push it further, back far further. But without written records or definitive radiocarbon data from the stones themselves, all we have are educated guesses and slowly accumulating doubts. The site covers over 3,000 hectares. Its terraces are arranged in 3 massive layers, forming a serpentine pattern that some say mimics lightning, others say mimics pumas, and still others claim is just coincidence. Theories range from fortress to ceremonial center to astronomical observatory to symbolic guardian of Cusco, the Inca capital, just downhill. But here's the catch. Much of what Sacsayhuaman was, is gone. After the Spanish conquest, much of the upper structure, temples, towers, finer buildings, was dismantled and carted off to build colonial Cusco. What remains are the foundations, the bones. The parts too big to move, the silent proof of an ambition we still don't fully comprehend. There's a violence to the silence at Sacsayhuaman. You stand before the walls and you don't just feel small, you feel outmatched, by technique, by intention, by the sheer physics of it all. The stones aren't just fitted, they're shaped to match each other with flowing, interlocking precision. Not flat, not stacked, melded. You could run a knife along the seam and it wouldn't find a crack. Some stones have 12, 13 angles, no two matching. Others curve slightly, as if melted and molded. But there's no evidence of that, no scorch marks, no residue of heat. Just craftsmanship so advanced it borders on alien. There are no tool marks, no blueprints, no inscriptions. Just stones placed in patterns that seem mathematical, deliberate, but without any known formula. You don't build something like that by accident, and you don't build it for no reason. But the purpose remains unclear. Defensive, ceremonial, spiritual, all three, none? The zigzagging walls suggest fortification, But if this was a fortress, it was also a work of art. A fortress with flair, a stronghold that smiled. Some researchers propose acoustic property structures that could carry sound or music. Others point to astronomical alignments, saying the walls track solstices or constellations. But nothing has been conclusively proven. The absence of writing doesn't help. The Inca used quippus-knotted strings as a system of record-keeping, but their full linguistic function is still largely undeciphered. Whatever deeper symbolic meaning was encoded in the design of Sacsayhuaman, it was likely never written down. Or, if it was destroyed. Which brings us back to the Inca themselves. They did build here, they honored the site, they expanded it, but even they engineers in their own right, masters of the mountains, seemed to treat Sacsayhuaman with a kind of reverence. Like it wasn't entirely theirs, like they were continuing something rather than beginning it. That's a pattern we've seen before. Civilizations inheriting ruins and treating them like sacred artifacts, the Egyptians building atop older sites, the Greeks reusing Mycenaean stones, the Romans integrating Etruscan temples. But what if that inheritance goes back even further? What if some ruins are so old, they don't belong to any known culture? Alternative theorists, the ones academic archaeologists roll their eyes at, suggest Sacsayhuaman may predate the Inca by millennia, that it's a fragment of a lost pre-Andean civilization. That perhaps we're looking at a site built in deep antiquity and simply reused by later peoples. It's speculative, but when the stones won't speak, speculation is all we have. And let's not forget the stories. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, the great creator god, a bringer of civilization who emerged from Lake Titicaca, traveled across the land, and vanished into the Pacific. He was said to have taught stoneworking and order before disappearing. In oral traditions, Viracocha isn't just a god, he's a memory, a placeholder for knowledge no longer understood. It's tempting to see him in the stones of Sacsayhuaman, not as a deity, but as a symbol of a forgotten builder, a forgotten age, a forgotten method. Because someone built this, and they did it on purpose. And then, as always, the silence followed. Today, Sacsayhuaman is a tourist site. People take selfies next to the 12-angled stone, marvel at the tight seams, and leave. But the walls stay, watching, enduring, refusing to explain. The stones don't care if we understand, they never did. But not far from here, on a completely different continent, there's another enigma. One that stretches across what is now the southeastern United States, a sprawling city with pyramids, plazas, and a culture no one talks about. They called it Cahokia. A city that rivaled medieval London, filled with ritual, violence, order, and a silence so complete, it's almost surgical. The Mississippians of Cahokia. Before New York, before Washington, before Boston and Philadelphia, and anything that could reasonably be called America, there was a city near the banks of the Mississippi River. It had pyramids, roads, a wooden wall taller than most European houses. It had plazas large enough for thousands to gather, observatories made of timbers aligned with the solstices, ceremonies that probably bled into violence, and a population that, at its peak, may have rivaled that of 12th century London. But you weren't taught this in school. This was Cahokia, the largest city north of Mexico before the arrival of Europeans. It sprawled across what is now Illinois, right outside modern-day St. Louis. If you drive past it today, you might miss it. The land looks like gentle hills, unusually symmetrical, mounds of earth, nothing flashy, nothing demanding. That's how a ghost city hides in plain sight. Cahokia was built by the Mississippian culture, a society that began rising around 800 CE and reached its peak between 1050 and 1200 CE. At its height, the city may have held 15,000 to 20,000 people, with even more in surrounding satellite communities, numbers that place it among the largest urban centers in the world at the time. But unlike London or Paris, Cahokia didn't grow out of medieval ambition. It grew out of earth. The centerpiece of Cahokia is Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid over 100 feet high and covering 14 acres at its base. It's still the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in the Americas. It took millions of baskets of soil to build, layer by layer, over generations. No stone, no metal tools, no beasts of burden, just will. We have no written record from Cahokia. The Mississippians had no writing system we know of. No books, no glyphs, only their earthworks, artifacts, and bones. So we piece together their story from patterned settlement layouts, burial customs, tool types, pottery shards. It's a puzzle where most of the pieces are dirt. And yet, the picture that emerges is staggering. Cahokia wasn't just a city, it was cosmology made physical, a planned layout, a spiritual blueprint rendered in soil and sweat. The plazas were laid out on cardinal directions. The city was aligned with celestial events. One site, now called Woodhenge, consisted of large timber posts arranged in a circle that marked the solstices and equinoxes. It was a calendar, a temple, and likely a stage for spectacle. This wasn't random settlement, it was ritualized space. A city built not just to house people, but to express a worldview. And then, suddenly, that world was gone. By the mid-1300s, Cahokia was abandoned. Its mounds left to the elements, the plazas grew weeds, the rituals ceased, the people, gone. No mass graves, no obvious war, no invasion, just absence. Why? Theories abound. Environmental collapse is a favorite. Deforestation, soil depletion, floods from the overuse of the land surrounding the Mississippi floodplain. Climate instability, disease. Some archaeologists point to social unrest, the breakdown of political or religious authority, others to overpopulation. Or maybe Cahokia simply couldn't sustain the weight of its own structure like a dream too heavy to hold. But the real mystery isn't just why it collapsed, it's how completely it was forgotten. When European settlers arrived centuries later, they found the mounds but had no idea what they were. Some thought they were natural hills. Others claimed the work of lost tribes, Phoenicians, Atlanteans, Welshmen, anything but Native Americans, anything but the truth. The myth of the vanishing Indian was easier to swallow than the idea of indigenous cities, indigenous architects, indigenous astronomers. So Cahokia was edited out of the American story. Buried under highways, cornfields, and cultural amnesia. And yet, Cahokia remains. Monk's Mound still rises from the earth, stubborn and silent. Archaeologists have unearthed clues, ceremonial copper, finely crafted shell beads, effigy statues. The remains of human sacrifices, young women buried without ceremony, lined up like offerings. They found mass graves, signs of elite privilege and brutal hierarchy. Evidence that Cahokia, for all its grandeur, was also a city built on control. There are signs of walls being built around certain neighborhoods, palisades, wooden fortifications enclosing the central mounds and plazas. This wasn't just a ceremonial site, it was political, possibly oppressive. Cahokia's rulers, whoever they were, commanded enormous labor forces. They orchestrated large-scale events. Some believe Monk's Mound itself may have been the seat of a theocratic ruler, a priest-king, or council of spiritual elites. Whatever the truth, it wasn't egalitarian. The remains tell us that. And maybe that's part of why it vanished. If the social contract breaks, if the faith in your ruler or your gods disintegrates, what happens to the city built in their name? Maybe Cahokia didn't collapse in a single event. Maybe it bled out. Rituals faltered. Crops failed. The people drifted away, took their stories with them. And the silence grew. Today, the site is protected but barely. Monk's Mound sits next to highways, shopping centers, and warehouses. The ghosts live in the shadows of semis and parking lots. Most Americans have never heard of it. We remember Roanoke, where 115 people vanished. But we forget Cahokia, where 20,000 lived and left no message. Because Cahokia wasn't lost, it was ignored. That's the thread running through all these vanished civilizations, not just the act of disappearance, but the response to it, the silence afterward. The way memory unravels not through destruction but disinterest. And speaking of silence, let's head east again, back across the Atlantic, to the Balkan Hills, to a culture older than Sumer. One that built homes, cities, entire societies, and then deliberately destroyed them. We're going back before writing, to a mystery even archaeologists don't like to talk about. The Vinca. They left behind a script, maybe, or a hoax, or a warning. No one knows. The Vinca culture. Before Babylon, before Egypt, before writing had rules. There was something strange happening in the Balkans. A culture began to emerge, not flashy, not imperial, not defined by war or monuments, but by pattern, rhythm, pottery so precise it bordered on obsession, homes arranged with suspicious uniformity, and artifacts etched with symbols that no one could quite decipher, even today. This was the Vinca culture, sometimes called Old Europe's first civilization. And like a ghostwriter who never finished the book, they left behind only half a language, half a story, and a silence that stretches deeper than most ruins dare to go. The Vinca people lived from around 5,700 to 4,500 BCE, centered in what is now Serbia and parts of Romania, Bulgaria, and Bosnia. They built some of the earliest known permanent settlements in Europe, villages with grid-like layouts, multi-room homes, ovens, wells, even furniture carved from clay. These weren't mud huts in the wilderness, these were blueprints. They worked copper before the so-called Copper Age. They traded across regions. They mass-produced pottery with designs that could pass for modern minimalist art. And they left behind over 700 known symbols scratched, painted, or impressed into pottery, figurines, and spindle whorls. Not random marks, not doodles. Symbols. Structured, repeating, systematic. It has the flavor of writing, but it isn't. Or maybe it was, and we simply never found enough of it. Or maybe it was something else entirely: ritual language, mnemonic code, proto-script, proto-propaganda. Whatever it was, we call it the Vinca symbols. But they've never been deciphered, and they might never be. Because the Vinca didn't leave us a Rosetta Stone. They didn't leave tombs, or kings, or statues of themselves flexing over battlefields. They left objects: figurines, ceramics, carved tools, each with careful, often repeated etchings, patterns, dots, crosses, inverted triangles. Some of them look almost absurdly contemporary, like alien emojis scratched onto clay. And that has, predictably, driven people off the cliff of speculation. Some say the Vinca script is the oldest writing system in the world, predating Sumerian cuneiform by over 1,000 years. Others claim it's not writing at all, but a kind of symbolic shorthand for religious or domestic purposes. Then there's the fringe crowd, linking Vinca to ancient aliens, Atlantean diaspora, or forgotten science, because, of course they do. But here's what we do know. The Vinca built large, stable settlements, some with populations that may have reached several thousand people. They were peaceful. No weapons found in graves. No evidence of warfare. No signs of hierarchical control or elite classes. Their homes were equal in size, evenly spaced. It wasn't paradise, but it was balanced. And then, around 4,500 BCE, it ended. Not with fire. Not with an invasion, but with a disappearance. The settlements were abandoned, the culture unraveled, and the symbols stopped. No records, no migration trails, no successor civilization preserving their legacy. Just the silence of people who may have gotten too comfortable, or too static, or simply too human. One theory suggests they ran out of arable land. Another, that their agricultural practices depleted the soil. Others blame climate shifts or the arrival of more aggressive, warlike tribes from the Eurasian steppes. But the truth is, no one really knows. What's left behind are the fragments of an intelligence we don't recognize. A culture that felt deeply organized, but never bothered to explain itself to the future. That's the thing about the Vinca. They weren't trying to be remembered. Or maybe they thought they didn't need to be. Maybe they thought the patterns were enough. That the symbols would outlive explanation. That form was meaning. Or maybe they thought we'd get it eventually. That the signs would click into place and the spiral would reveal its center, but we haven't. And every year that passes makes it less likely that we will. Archaeologists argue over whether the Vinca symbols constitute writing. They throw words around like semiotic system, or logogram cluster, or proto-script, but none of those terms answer the central question. What were they trying to say? Because you don't carve hundreds of symbols, across centuries, across dozens of sites, unless you're trying to say something. Maybe it was religion. Maybe it was law. Maybe it was as mundane as, this pot belongs to Vojislav. Maybe it was poetry. Or maybe it was silence masquerading as language. A ritual system designed not to inform, but to transform, to anchor the invisible into the visible. And then, when the ritual lost its power, so did the symbols. The Vinca are rarely discussed in textbooks. They don't make it into school curriculums. Their cities weren't made of stone. Their gods weren't anthropomorphized. Their legacy isn't conquest, it's confusion. Which is maybe the most honest legacy a civilization can leave. Because every written language we now understand was once an indecipherable code. Every culture we now venerate was once an unsolved mystery. The only difference is, we cracked some of the codes. We haven't cracked the Vinca, not yet. And maybe we never will. So what do you do with a culture that built no monuments, fought no wars, wrote symbols no one can read, and then disappeared without leaving so much as a farewell note? You do what the Vinca themselves did. You observe the pattern, and you wait. Because silence is still a form of communication. And speaking of silence that might not be what it seems, there's another culture much more recent that seems to have followed a similar rhythm. They built a vast trade empire, carved tombs into cliffs, constructed a rose-red city in the desert, and then ghosted the world. But we've already met them once, haven't we? So let's go deeper into that red stone. Let's look not just at what they built, but how they disappeared. The Nabateans, revisited. You already know the view. You've seen it in postcards, documentaries, and Indiana Jones movies. A narrow gorge opens up into sunlight. Sandstone cliffs blush red, gold, rose, and out of the rock itself, a temple emerges, not built, but carved, like a revelation frozen in stone. Al-Khazneh, the treasury, Petra. But here's the part that keeps slipping through the cracks. No one was home. The city was empty when it was found. No kings, no courts, no scribes, no stories. The Nabateans, the masters of Petra, left behind architecture, but not autobiography. And that absence is the loudest thing they ever said. We talked about the Nabateans before, their desert hydrology, their surreal architecture, their sudden disappearance, but the surface facts don't do justice to just how strange it all is. Because this wasn't some obscure, backwater tribe. The Nabateans were a powerhouse. From the 4th century BCE to the 2nd century CE, they controlled one of the most lucrative trade routes in the ancient world: incense, spices, silk, ivory flowing from Arabia to the Mediterranean. Petra was their jewel, carved into the cliffs of southern Jordan, but they had outposts stretching from Damascus to Medina. They weren't just wealthy, they were strategic. Their language was a dialect of Aramaic, but their culture was an alchemical blend: Arabic, Hellenistic, Egyptian, Mesopotamian. Their gods were a syncretic pantheon with familiar shapes but unfamiliar names. Their temples echoed Greek forms, but with desert logic. Their inscriptions were few, but precise. And then nothing. By the 4th century CE, the Nabateans had disappeared. Not just faded, evaporated. Here's the thing that gets buried in textbooks. There was no great war, no dramatic conquest. The Romans annexed their territory in 106 CE, but it was almost peaceful. A bureaucratic takeover. The Nabateans were absorbed like a company being bought out. They didn't resist. They didn't rebel. They just left the stage. Petra itself declined slowly. Trade routes shifted. The Red Sea and the Persian Gulf became more profitable. Overland caravans lost relevance. Earthquakes did their part. And by the time Islamic expansion swept the region centuries later, the Nabateans had already become ghosts. But here's the twist. They left the set intact. Petra wasn't destroyed. It wasn't buried. It wasn't overrun by jungle or desert. It was preserved. As if they planned their disappearance to be as aesthetically immaculate as their architecture. Imagine a civilization exiting history with a bow, quietly, elegantly, no curtain call, just vacancy. Most civilizations die screaming. The Nabateans vanished in plain sight. And that's what makes them terrifying. Because they had everything: trade, culture, architecture, innovation. They mastered water in the desert. They designed a city that looked like myth made manifest, and then they chose not to stay. We talk about collapse like it's always a tragedy. But what if this was something else? Not failure, not weakness, but completion. What if the Nabateans simply outgrew the game? They'd made their wealth, they'd built their monuments, they'd inscribed their secrets in sandstone. Maybe they realized that permanence isn't about legacy, it's about knowing when to vanish before history turns you into a ruin. We see Petra now, and think of it as a tomb, a monument to a lost people. But what if it was never meant to be remembered that way? What if Petra was a ritual of forgetting? Think about the treasury's facade monumental, dramatic, theatrical, but behind it, a small room, no treasure, no throne, no grand narrative, just the echo of expectation. It's performance architecture, a mask. Everything about Petra plays with illusion, elaborate facades with minimal interiors, tombs made for the viewer, not the occupant, a city designed to impress, but not necessarily to explain. And that makes you wonder, were the Nabateans telling us something? Were they warning us? That visibility isn't immortality? That you can build something magnificent and still vanish without a trace? Because here's the secret nobody likes to hear. Most civilizations aren't conquered, they're forgotten. And the Nabateans, in their eerie brilliance, might have been the first to understand that. They didn't leave behind heroic epics. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't fight to be remembered. They built a city, made it breathtaking, and then walked away. And we still don't know why. But maybe they were part of a broader tradition, ancient cultures who understood that disappearance isn't always a loss, that to vanish well might be the final act of control, the ultimate expression of power. Because if no one knows your ending, you control the myth. And speaking of myths, let's talk about a different kind of disappearance, one that didn't happen in the desert, or the jungle, or the mountains, one that happened on an island, isolated, remote, impossibly far from everywhere. An island with statues, hundreds of them, faces too big, eyes too wide, watching the sea. The people who carved them? Gone. The trees? Gone. The meaning? Gone. We call it Easter Island. They called it Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui. The ocean doesn't like to give things back. It keeps what it takes: secrets, ships, civilizations. And sometimes, what it leaves behind is more disturbing than what it swallows. Like Rapa Nui. A speck in the Pacific. A volcanic whisper thousands of miles from anywhere. The last place you'd expect to find giants. And yet, there they are. The Moai. Stone faces. Heavy-lidded, solemn, watching nothing, watching everything. Carved from volcanic rock and placed along the coastline like sentinels guarding a story we forgot to read. There are nearly 900 of them. Some stand, some lie half-buried. Some were abandoned mid-carve in the quarry at Rano Raraku. All of them face inward, toward the island, toward the people who no longer understood why they were watching. Because the people who carved the Mowaith, original Rapa Nui, disappeared. Not in the mythical sense, not in a single apocalyptic event, but in stages, like a slow-motion vanishing act. They arrived on the island around 1200 CE, navigating thousands of miles of open ocean in double-hulled canoes. They brought chickens, bananas, sweet potatoes, and a spiritual worldview carved into every stone they touched. And they thrived. For a while. Rapa Nui is only about 63 square miles, isolated, but the early inhabitants turned it into a kind of sacred blueprint. They divided the island into clan territories. They built ceremonial platforms called ahu, and they erected the moe massive stone heads with torsos buried in the earth representing ancestral chiefs, spiritual conduits, divine lineage. This wasn't just art, it was belief, scaled up to geological proportions. But then the forest disappeared. That's where the story fractures, because by the time European explorers first reached Rapa Nui in the 18th century, the island was almost entirely deforested. No trees taller than shrubs, no canoes, no birds of flight. And the people fewer, divided, malnourished, stripped of memory. So what happened? The traditional narrative reads like a cautionary tale written by nature itself. The Rapa Nui, in their zeal to honor their ancestors, cut down their forests primarily to transport the moai. They used logs as rollers, ropes, levers. It took an absurd amount of manpower and material to move even a single statue from quarry to ahu. And then, one day, the trees were gone. No trees meant no canoes. No canoes meant no fishing. No fishing meant famine. Famine meant social collapse. Collapse meant war. War meant moai no longer sacred, but toppled. This version of the story has become environmentalist gospel, a tragic lesson in ecological hubris. Jared Diamond canonized it in Collapse. The Rapa Nui overexploited their resources and the island punished them. But it's not the whole story. And maybe not even the right one. More recent scholarship challenges the doomsday narrative. Some researchers argue that the island's decline didn't begin until after European contact. That rats, introduced by the first settlers, played a larger role in deforestation by eating seeds and preventing regrowth. That moai may have been walked upright using rope and leverage, not rolled on timber. That the people of Rapa Nui adapted, innovated, survived longer and more cleverly than they've been given credit for. In this version, the real collapse begins after 1722, when Dutch explorers arrived and brought disease, and slavery, and cultural erasure. By the 19th century, Peruvian slavers had abducted a large portion of the island's population. Missionaries arrived shortly after, converting and suppressing native customs. Oral traditions were rewritten, suppressed, or erased. Language was lost, rituals forbidden. By the time anthropologists showed up to ask questions, the answers were already gone. So which story is true? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the tragedy of Rapa Nui isn't just about deforestation or colonialism. Maybe it's about what happens when meaning itself disappears. The moai are still here. They weigh tons. They dominate the landscape. But what they mean? We're not sure. Ancestor worship, yes. But beyond that? Were they all spiritual? Were they political? Were they monuments to peace or warnings of war? There are signs that competition between clans led to ever larger Moyan escalation of sacred one-upmanship. You raise a 20-footer, we'll raise a 30. One-upsmanship on a volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. But eventually, they stopped carving, stopped raising, stopped watching. Some moai were toppled intentionally. Others were just abandoned. What do you call a civilization that built its entire identity around memory then forgot? A place where every stone was sacred, and every sacred object became a ruin. There are modern Rapa Nui people, of course, descendants, survivors, and in recent years there's been a revival, language reclamation, spiritual restoration, cultural pride. But the gap between now and then is wide. Because the silence didn't just fall, it was pushed. By colonizers, by academics, by a Western world that looked at Rapa Nui and saw a mystery, not a memory. Today, tourists fly in, take selfies with the moai, and fly out. They marvel at the scale, they ponder the logistics, but very few ask the real question. Not how they moved the statues, not why they were built, but what happens to a civilization that forgets what it was for. Because that's the horror of Rapa Nui. Not the collapse, but the disconnect. A people who built monuments to remember, and then had to stare into the stone faces of their ancestors and whisper, "I don't know who you are anymore." And speaking of monuments with forgotten meaning, let's go back across the ocean, back to Nigeria. To a set of stone monoliths, some shaped like humans, others like phantoms that rise out of the earth in silence. A megalithic mystery. A spiritual cipher. A place no one wrote about, but someone clearly honored. The Ikom monoliths. In a quiet corner of southeastern Nigeria, nestled between thick forest and rolling earth, stand over 300 stones, weathered, vertical, mysterious. They rise from the soil not in rows or grids, but in clusters like a conversation, frozen mid-sentence. Some are tall, others squat, some lean, some tilt. All of them carved. All of them silent. Welcome to Ikom. The Ikom monoliths, sometimes called the Akwanchi, meaning ancestors in stone, are scattered across more than 30 sites in the Cross River State. Carved from volcanic basalt, each one ranges from about 1 meter to 2 meters in height, but they feel taller, heavier, not because of their size, but because of what's not said about them. There are no texts, no origin story, no ancient scrolls describing why the stones were made or by whom. Oral traditions exist, vague, scattered, half-remembered tales that speak of ancestors, spirits, rites, but no firm chronology, no names, just the suggestion of reverence. Each stone is unique. Some have faces, big eyes, open mouths, exaggerated features. Others show hands, weapons, breasts, genitalia. Still, others are covered in strange geometric patterns, spirals, triangles, dots. They weren't just art, they were symbols. They meant something. But that meaning was never written down, and now it hovers like mist around the monoliths, haunting without resolving. Archaeologists estimate the stones could be between 200 to 1,500 years old, possibly even older. But the people who created them left no durable architecture, no metal, no known writing system. Just these stones, half human, half totem, standing like sentinels at the edge of memory. And that edge is crumbling. For decades, the monoliths were largely ignored by formal historians. They weren't grand enough. They didn't fit the clean timelines of African empires like Benin or Mali. And so, like many indigenous artifacts without an empire's seal of approval, they were treated as curiosities rather than clues. But if you look closely, you start to see a pattern. The monoliths are often found near ancient village sites. They're clustered in areas that suggest territorial boundaries, ceremonial zones, or ritual gathering places. Some seem to mark graves. Others may have been used in fertility rites, social contracts, or initiation ceremonies. One theory suggests the stones were created by the Ekoi or Ajegam people, whose descendants still live in the region. Their traditional art, wood carvings, body painting, facial scarification, bears eerie resemblance to the features carved into the stones. Another theory links the monoliths to secret societies, closed circles of spiritual power and governance that dominated many West African cultures. These societies maintained balance, justice, ritual. And they used symbols. The stones may have been records not written, but sculpted, histories of the living and the dead, contracts in stone, laws, lineages, blood-bound agreements. But again, no confirmation, no smoking chisel. Just guesswork and granite. Some stones have been defaced, others stolen. A few ended up in foreign museums, stripped of their context. Others lie half-buried, eaten by moss, forgotten by the very villages that once may have revered them. Because the real disappearance here isn't the culturates, the continuity. We know who lives in Cross River today. We know the languages they speak, the stories they tell. But somewhere between now and then, the translation broke down. The meaning behind the monoliths slipped through time's fingers. The chain of knowledge, handed down for generations, snapped, and the stones became strangers. It's the same story we've seen before, and will see again. People create meaning. They encode it into objects. Those objects outlast the people. And the meaning dies alone. The Ecom monoliths ask the same question as Göbekli Tepe, the Vinca symbols, the Moai of Rapa Nui. What do we do when we no longer understand the things we once believed in? Do we guess? Do we rebuild the rituals from fragments? Do we project our fears and fantasies onto them? Or do we let the silence speak for itself? There's a haunting possibility that the monoliths weren't meant to be understood forever, that they were made to mark a momentane era, a belief, a pact that had an expiration date. And when that moment passed, the symbols calcified, no longer active, no longer relevant. Just stone. But there's something powerful about the act of carving them in the first place. It takes effort to make a monument. It takes purpose. You don't chisel spirals and faces into rock unless you think someone or something is paying attention. Maybe the stones weren't for the living. Maybe they were for the ancestors. Or the gods. Or the earth. Or the future. Or maybe, just maybe, they were for us. A message sent through time, encrypted in ignorance. A question that survives only because no one ever answered it. The monoliths of Ecom are not buried, they are standing, which makes them different from the ruins we usually discuss. They're still visible, still there, still asking. And in that visibility lies a different kind of haunting. Not, what happened here? But, why don't you know? Why didn't you ask sooner? Why didn't you listen longer? Why did you wait until the stone started to fade? And now, another stone. Another forgotten kingdom. But this one didn't just leave behind monoliths. It left entire cities carved into mountain cliffs, hidden among clouds. A place of mystery and engineering, shrouded in fog and slowly being swallowed by jungle. We're going to Colombia now. To a city called Ciudad Perdida, the Lost City. A place so remote, it was forgotten for 400 years. Then rediscovered by looters who thought they'd found El Dorado. Ciudad Perdida. First, the stairs. That's how it begins. Not with a sign, not with a gate, but with an endless staircase, stone steps cut into the Colombian jungle, climbing like a thought that doesn't want to finish itself. You hike for days through cloud forest, across rivers, over cliffs, dodging snakes and old ghosts. And then you reach it, Ciudad Perdida, the lost city. Except it was never really lost. Just left alone. Forgotten not by accident, but by neglect. And when you stand there, high in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, looking down at the moss-covered terraces and ceremonial platforms, one thing becomes very clear. This place was not meant to be easy to reach. Or easy to forget. Ciudad Perdida, also known as Tayuna, to the indigenous communities who still revere it, was once the heart of the Tairona civilization, a mountain-dwelling people who flourished in northern Colombia long before the Spanish arrived. It was likely built around 800 CE, centuries before Machu Picchu, and housed thousands of people at its peak. But you've probably never heard of it. That's not coincidence. That's strategy. The jungle erases what the conquerors miss. The Tairona weren't empire builders in the usual sense. They didn't leave behind massive armies or sprawling dominions. Instead, they built networks of settlements, of trade, of ritual. Their cities were carved into steep mountainsides, connected by stone roads, and oriented toward rivers, spirits, and stars. Ciudad Perdida was the crown jewel. And when the conquistadors came, the Tairona vanished into the forest. They didn't meet the Spanish with open arms. They didn't roll over. They resisted, and then they disappeared. What was once a thriving city built with astronomical precision, lined with gold offerings and sacred plazas, swallowed by vegetation, cloud cover, and generational silence. By the 1600s, the Spanish weren't talking about the Tairona anymore. They were too busy building churches on top of native altars, rewriting history one sermon at a time. The mountains grew quiet. For nearly 400 years, no outsider set eyes on Ciudad Perdida. Until 1972. That's when looters stumbled on the stone steps. They called it the Green Hell, a treasure hunter's fever dream. They weren't looking for culture, they were looking for gold. They found its ceremonial urns, pendants, figurines, and sold most of it on the black market. That's how the site was rediscovered, not by scholars, but by thieves. When archaeologists finally caught up, it was already too late to retrieve much of the original artifact context. But what remained, what still remains, is a city built not for defense, not for spectacle, but for alignment. With nature, with time, with meaning. Ciudad Perdida consists of more than 170 stone terraces, cut into the slope of the mountain, arranged in concentric platforms, circular plazas, interconnected walkways. Staircases that seem to lead everywhere and nowhere, water channels that still function, pathways that snake through jungle like veins. There's no monumental temple, no royal palace, but there is order. And, in that order, purpose. The Tairona believed in balance, harmony with the environment. They worked with the land, not against it. Their cities were designed to coexist, not conquer. And maybe that's why they vanished so effectively, because disappearing was the one thing they'd always been good at. They didn't get eradicated, they got invisible. Today, descendants of the Taironathe Kogi, Wiwa, Arwako, and Kankwamo still live in the region. They walk the same paths, perform the same rituals, speak to the same spirits. They say Ciudad Perdida was never lost, it was simply waiting. They call it Tayuna, and for them, it was always sacred. To outsiders, it's a marvel. To the descendants, it's home. And that creates a strange tension. Because now the site is open to tourist-guided treks through the jungle, photo ops on moss-covered stones, the Indiana Jones experience for backpackers with decent boots and questionable intentions. But the locals warn, this isn't just archaeology. It's memory. And memory doesn't like to be disturbed. Archaeologists believe that Tairona abandoned Ciudad Perdida during the 16th century in the wake of colonial violence, disease, enslavement, cultural devastation. But there's no massacre layer, no siege remnants, no written record of a fall. The city wasn't burned or destroyed. It was walked away from. Like a song that ends mid-note. Like a story that gets too painful to finish. Some say the priests knew it was over, that the city couldn't be saved, but the meaning could. So they took what they could, buried what they couldn't, and faded back into the forest to preserve the ritual, if not the stone. The Kogi elders still talk about balance. About the younger brothers of the worldush who've forgotten how to live in harmony with the earth. They say the mountain cities were built to keep the world in balance. And now that balance is gone. They didn't build Ciudad Perdida to last forever. They built it to remind us. But we forgot anyway. Now the jungle tries to hold the city close. Every year the plants reclaim more, the moss gets thicker, the paths narrow. Nature is not impressed by legacy. It doesn't care if we forget. The stairs will still be there, leading nowhere, leading everywhere. Ciudad Perdida is not just a city. It's a haunting. Not of ghosts, but of what we should have known. Of how to live without walls. Of how to disappear without destruction. And that brings us naturally to one last twist of irony. Because as the Tirona were vanishing into the mist, another civilization was building something entirely different. Not balance. Not memory. But obsession. A culture in West Africa that built stone cities in the grasslands, trade centers, complex bureaucracy, fortresses, and then, when empires rose and new borders were drawn, it was left behind. We're going to Zimbabwe now. To a place the colonists tried to deny was even African. Great Zimbabwe. In the heart of southern Africa, where the savanna stretches wide and gold veins run deep beneath the soil, there stands a ruin too monumental to ignore and too uncomfortable to accept. Its walls are vast, its architecture precise, its symbolism complex. It was a city built of stone, without mortar, without iron, without any help from Europe. Thank you very much. Its name? Great Zimbabwe. And for over 400 years, European colonists, missionaries, and even archaeologists did everything they could to insist it had nothing to do with black Africans. Because sometimes, the most threatening thing in the world is proof that people you tried to erase were once extraordinary. Let's rewind. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a powerful kingdom that thrived between the 11th and 15th centuries CE. It sat at the center of a massive trade network that extended all the way to the Swahili coast, Arabia, India, and even China. Its people traded gold, ivory, and cattle in exchange for glass beads, ceramics, textiles. This wasn't some dusty tribal outpost. It was a player on the world stage. And its seat of power? A stone metropolis built in the heart of the bush, made with skill, labor, and intention. The city consists of three main zones. The hill complex, a sacred acropolis believed to be a royal or spiritual center. The great enclosure, with 11-meter-high walls and massive stone structures, enclosing towers and ritual areas. The valley ruins, a sprawl of homes, workshops, and lower-class residences. In total, Great Zimbabwe may have supported 18,000 people at its peak. Let that number sit for a moment. That's not a village. That's not a shrine. That's a city. Its walls, especially in the great enclosure, were constructed using carefully cut granite blocks, stacked without mortar, in tight-fitting patterns that have withstood 6 centuries of weather and human tampering. The outer wall alone stretches over 800 feet in circumference. One tower inside it, called the Conical Tower, still defies clear interpretation. Granary, temple, monument? We don't know. And that, of course, is where the trouble started. When Europeans discovered Great Zimbabwe in the 19th century, already long abandoned, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Stone architecture? In Africa? Built by Africans? That didn't fit the colonial narrative. So they changed the story. Early European scholars claimed the site must have been built by foreigners, Phoenicians, Arabs, Egyptians, King Solomon's men. Anyone but the ancestors of the local Shona people who had actually lived there. British archaeologist James Theodore Bent was sent in 1891 by Cecil Rhodes himself to confirm that Great Zimbabwe had non-African origins. Unsurprisingly, he obliged, proposing that the ruins were the work of ancient Semitic builders, and for decades, that was the official story printed in textbooks, maps, and museum placards. But it was a lie. Later, more honest archaeologists, people like Gertrude Caton Thompson, proved conclusively in the 1920s and 1930s that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans. The pottery, tools, cultural continuity with the Shona people. It was all there, undeniable. And yet, the lie persisted. Because it's hard to dismantle a fantasy when that fantasy props up your power. Even into the 20th century, white minority governments in what was then Rhodesia tried to suppress the truth about Great Zimbabwe. School children were taught the ruins were mysterious. African guides were discouraged from discussing their cultural heritage. Museums avoided uncomfortable facts. All because a stone city in the African interior was just a little too advanced for the story colonialism needed to tell. But here's the twist. The site was already abandoned by the time Europeans ever saw it. By around 1450, Great Zimbabwe had been vacated. The reasons? Still unclear. Environmental decline, overgrazing, drought, shifts in trade routes, political upheaval? A combination of all the above? Whatever the cause, the capital was relocated northward. The city crumbled slowly, the people moved on, the stones stayed. And in that stillness, in that quiet desertion, a space was created not just for ruin, but for invention. When a culture leaves no written records, others rush in to write the story for them. With their own pen. And their own agenda. But the Shona people never forgot. Even today, their oral traditions speak of the builders, they speak of the Mbara, the spiritual music that echoed in those stone walls, of ancestors who watched the trade caravans come and go, of a civilization that didn't need pyramids or papyrus to matter. The very name of the country Zimbabwe is derived from Dzimba Dzamabwe, meaning houses of stone. It's a name reclaimed. A narrative rewritten from within. And the city itself? Still there. Still massive. Still strange. The conical tower, the purpose of the great walls, the symbolism of the soapstone birds found on site, all remains unsettled, interpreted, reinterpreted, whispered about. And that's the thing. Great Zimbabwe doesn't just challenge colonial lies. It challenges our modern ones too. Like the lie that you need to write things down to be civilized. Or the lie that memory only matters if it's exported. Or the lie that greatness only counts if it was witnessed by outsiders. Great Zimbabwe was great without needing to explain itself. And in that quiet confidence, it joins the long list of civilizations that thrived without footnotes, collapsed without fanfare, and endured without permission. But let's move farther east now into the Indian Ocean. To an island chain often remembered for its beaches, not its mystery. But beneath the palm trees and postcards lies a civilization that once built stone tombs, intricate rituals, and sprawling settlements, all swallowed by jungle and rewritten by empire. We're headed to the Maldives next. But not the one from the travel brochures. The Redden people. Say Maldives, and most people picture turquoise waters, overwater bungalows, and infinity pools that stretch into forever. But that's today's illusion. Before the honeymooners, before the colonial flags, before the resort empires, there were the Redden. And they didn't come to relax. They came to build. And then they disappeared. Scattered across the coral islands of the Maldives, beneath layers of sand and roots, lie ruins no travel blogger ever photographs. Ancient stone foundations, intricate burial tombs, coral-stacked temples known as Havitha, and inscriptions in a script no one bothered to keep alive. The official story of Maldivian history begins around the 3rd century BCE with Indo-Aryan settlers. Later came Islamic conversion in the 12th century, followed by Portuguese, Dutch, and British interference, each colonial chapter footnoted and footwashed for easy digestion. But before all of that, archaeological clues point to something stranger, something older. A culture that lived on these atolls before recorded memory. A people who carved out a life on islands barely wide enough for the tide to tolerate. A people some now call the Redden. That name isn't in textbooks. You won't find it in official chronologies. It survives mostly in fragments oral legends, half-preserved stonework, local whispers passed down in fishing villages, and overlooked shrine sites. The Redden, according to the tales, were powerful, mysterious, skilled in stonework, despite living on an island chain with almost no indigenous stone. They carved coral instiadents, unforgiving, fossilized coral. They built tombs, mosques, and circular shrines on raised platforms. Some of their structures suggest astronomical alignments. Others are clearly ceremonial. A few are still standing, clinging to the edges of inhabited islands like forgotten punctuation marks. No one knows exactly when the Redden lived. Estimates range from 1000 BCE to the early centuries of the Common Era. And what little we have is deeply inconsistent patchwork data from underwater archaeology, miscatalogued temple fragments, and scattered oral traditions dismissed for generations as folklore. The problem is context. The Maldives are hard to excavate, islands shift, tides erase, salt corrodes. And the Redden, for all their craft, left no writing system we can read. There's a chance they used an early form of Divza Kuru, a script that eventually evolved into the Maldivian Thana alphabet. But it's impossible to prove. What survives are symbols, markings, carvings that might have been names or prayers, or nothing. Just patterns pretending to be memory. Some archaeologists believe the Redden were connected to the broader Indian Ocean trade network, that they may have been Proto-Dravidian seafarers. Others suggest Austronesian roots. There are even hints of contact with early Arab traders and Persian navigators. But what makes the Redden so strange is not who they were, but how completely they were overwritten. Because the Islamic conversion of the Maldives in 1153 CE was total, monuments were destroyed, pre-Islamic practices were demonized. Entire histories were scrubbed, rewritten, or left to rot in the humidity. Coral tombs became taboo, ancient rites were outlawed, and slowly, the Redden were unremembered. Not just forgotten, intentionally erased. It's a pattern, of course. One we've seen in Zimbabwe, in Rapa Nui, in Petra. The new faith arrives, the old gods are buried, the stones are condemned. What can't be explained is called blasphemy. What can't be used is discarded. The Redden didn't survive that transition. Or maybe they did, but only as echoes. Some islanders still whisper stories of the Reddy Raja, shadowy kings with powers drawn from the sea, of spirits trapped in coral blocks, of shrines that cry in the wind. These aren't historical records. They're trauma in mythological clothing. There are even tales mostly dismissed by academics of giants who once roamed the islands, of people who built with coral like it was wood, of knowledge too dangerous to write down. Fantasy? Maybe. But fantasy is often just fact in exile. What we do know is that, in several parts of the Maldives, ancient Havatha still stand. They're not advertised, they're not on tourist maps. Some are half-buried, others used as foundations for newer mosques. But their forms remain: low circular walls, raised platforms, stepped terraceous built from coral, all outlasting the memory of who made them. Some of the coral stones are carved with what look like faces, others with spiral motifs. A few have been turned upside down or repurposed entirely. It's archaeology by accident. Anthropology as rubble. And every time someone digs a well, repaves a road, or clears a coconut grove, a new piece of the puzzle emerges and is quickly ignored. Because what do you do with a civilization that doesn't fit the narrative? The Maldives are now 100% Muslim, proudly so. The idea that their sacred islands were once ruled by forgotten stone carvers, possibly animists or sun worshippers or something far stranger, doesn't sit well. It gets filed under myths and boxed away. But there are still those who remember. Old island families who leave offerings at crumbling shrines, children warned not to walk near certain stones at night, fishermen who swear the sea behaves differently around the oldest Havatha. Because the past never really disappears, it just waits to be named again. And maybe that's what the Redden were trying to do, not dominate, not conquer, but be remembered. They built with Coralth, softest of stones. They left no books, no kings, just structures too stubborn to collapse, symbols too vague to translate, and a legacy too threatening to embrace. What kind of civilization does that? One that understood that memory doesn't always need clarity. Just presence. Just place. And now, let's leave the ocean. Let's head back inland. To a place where memory didn't erode, was burned. Where cities were reduced to blackened skeletons. Not by fire alone, but by their own hands. You remember them. You met them in the shadow of the Cucuteni Tripilia. But there's another layer beneath that story. Another civilization that destroyed itself ritualistically, cyclically. Only this one built pyramids. You're not in Egypt. You're in Mexico. The builders of Teotihuacan. You walk down the Avenue of the Dead, and it's quiet. Too quiet for a city that once held over 100,000 people. Too quiet for a place called the City of the Gods. Too quiet for what used to be the beating heart of Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan is vast. Stone plazas that once pulsed with ritual. Pyramids that scrape the sky, the pyramid of the sun, the pyramid of the moon, structures built without metal, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. Built by hand. Built by intention. And then left behind. Abandoned by its builders. Burned, broken, forgotten by name. Today, we call it Teotihuacan, a name given by the Aztecs centuries after the fall. It means the place where the gods were born. But the people who built it? We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what they called their city. Because they never told us. The civilization that created Teotihuacan emerged sometime around 100 BCE. At its height, between 100 and 600 CE, the city was one of the largest in the world, larger than Rome at one point. An empire in stone, multicultural, multilingual, monumental. It wasn't just a religious center, it was a metropolis. There were apartment compounds, markets, obsidian workshops, murals, ceremonial complexes. The city was laid out on a massive grid meticulously aligned to astronomical points. Urban planning that feels like it came from the mind of a mathematician priest. And that's part of the mystery. Because everything about Teotihuacan screams order. And yet it ended in chaos. By 750 CE, the city was abandoned. The central temples torched. Religious icons smashed. The elite quarters destroyed. It wasn't an invasion. There's no evidence of conquest. No conquering army. This was internal. This was self-destruction. But why? Some theories point to environmental degradation. Others to class revolt, a society so rigid it finally snapped. Still others to religious schism. Maybe the priests lost control. Maybe the gods stopped listening. Whatever the cause, it was final. And we didn't even know who they were. To this day, archaeologists argue over their identity. Were they Totonac, Otomi, Nahua, a fusion? A singular culture, or a confederation of ethnic groups living under one engineered skyline? The murals give us hints: jaguars, serpents, ceremonial scenes, but not clarity. The glyphs, minimal, stylized. Some don't match any known writing system. Teotihuacan wasn't a civilization obsessed with writing. It was a civilization obsessed with space and ritual. The entire city is a cosmogram. The pyramid of the sun is aligned with the setting sun on specific dates. The pyramid of the moon anchors the northern end of the Avenue of the Dead. The temple of the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatlus, adorned with serpent heads and surrounded by mass graves. Yes, mass graves. More than 200 sacrificial victims have been found beneath and around the temple of the feathered serpent, men, women, and children, some bound, others decapitated, interred with obsidian knives and elaborate adornments. Ritual sacrifice wasn't a side note, it was a foundation. Teotihuacan didn't just build for the gods. It fed them. But at some point, something broke. The sacrifices stopped working. Or the priests demanded too much. Or the people refused to believe. And then flame. Some researchers believe the burning of the temples and elite compounds was an act of popular revolt, the working classes rising up, tearing down their oppressors, erasing the god kings. If true, it would make Teotihuacan's fall not just a collapse, but a revolution. But then why didn't they stay? Why not rebuild? Why vanish into the hills? Because maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the goal wasn't to claim the city. Maybe it was to end it. The Aztecs, arriving centuries later, found Teotihuacan as ruins. They didn't try to repopulate it. They didn't rename the gods. They simply worshipped the wreckage. To them, it was divine architecture. Too sacred to understand. Too mysterious to ignore. They walked its streets with awe. They believed gods had been born here. And maybe they were right. Because what is divinity, if not the power to make something so vast that its builders don't even matter anymore? Teotihuacan is one of those places where absence feels engineered. Like its creators knew they wouldn't be remembered, but wanted the stones to speak for them anyway. Like they understood that people die, but symmetry can outlast memory. The murals fade. The names vanish. But the shape of the city still points to the sky. And maybe that's the legacy. Not power. Not empire. But geometry in service of mystery. You walk down the Avenue of the Dead, and the pyramids loom like questions. You climb the steps, and the wind hits you like a judgment. You look out over the ruins, and you feel something watching. Not ghosts. Not gods. Possibility. And speaking of possibility, there's a place in the middle of the Indian Ocean where a kingdom once flourished in isolation, a place where writing was sacred, where temples were hidden in mountains, and where the past was deliberately buried. A place called Lemuria, or so the legend says. But the actual mystery is real. It's called Kadathal Malai. And the Tamil people still whisper about what's lost beneath its soil. The Shadow Kingdom of Kadathal Malai. Somewhere off the southeastern coast of India, beneath the waves of the Bay of Bengal, lies a story too old to be verified and too persistent to be dismissed. It drifts between folklore and archaeology, scripture and shipwreck, like a ghost of a continent long since drowned. The name it's given is Lemuria, mythical landmass once believed to connect India to Madagascar, submerged by tectonic whim or divine judgment. Science discarded the idea over a century ago. But Tamil tradition never did. They call it Kumari Kandam. And if Lemuria is a theory, Kumari Kandam is a grief. But let's not start with myths. Let's start with Kadathal Malaya, real place, a hill temple, a ruin swallowed by soil and superstition. A site that may be the last surviving whisper of a lost kingdom so old it's spoken of in Sangam literature, Tamil's ancient poetic epics. The name Kadathal Malai roughly means the hill that was crossed, though some translate it as the hill of passage, and that ambiguity is fitting. Because everything about this site feels like a transition point between history and legend, land and sea, memory and myth. Located in Tamil Nadu, not far from the ancient port city of Korkai, Kadathal Malai is one of many elevated sites dotted with collapsed shrines, weather-worn carvings, and subterranean chambers. Archaeologists haven't officially excavated much of it, mostly due to logistical challenges and perhaps a little due to academic caution. Because what if the stories are true? Local legends say the hill was once part of a much larger temple complex, devoted to Tamil seafarers, sages, and sunken gods. They say the hill is all that remains of an empire swallowed by the Sion Empire of advanced knowledge, linguistic mastery, and moral failure. The Tamil epics especially, the Silappatikaram, and the commentaries of medieval poets make cryptic references to lands lost to the floods, kingdoms that sank in sorrow, and cities of learning that vanished because the people forgot the truth. It's poetic, but maybe it's not just poetry. Because marine archaeology along the Tamil coast has uncovered submerged ruined stone blocks, possible pier structures, ancient anchor stones off the coasts of Pumpuhar and Mahabalipuram. These may not prove the existence of Kumari Kandam, but they do prove that ancient Tamil kingdoms had coastal infrastructure now underwater. And the timelines get blurry fast. Ancient Tamil scholars claim that 3 sangams, poetic academies, existed across time, the first of which supposedly lasted 4,400 years and was located in a now-lost land south of modern India. Its destruction, they said, was a moral reckoninga flood not just of water, but of consequence. And this is where Kadathal Malai returns to focus. Some say the hill was a watchpoint, a place to observe the sea's advance. Others claim it was a sanctuary, a last stand for survivors who fled the rising tides. A few fringe theorists argue that the inscriptions found on nearby stones hint at astronomical alignment dates of celestial conjunctions, warnings of eclipses, and references to star-born floods. But the actual inscriptions are minimal, worn, fragmented, often unreadable, which makes them perfect for speculation. Because what do you do with a history that refuses to verify itself? Kadathal Malai doesn't confirm anything. It just exists, quietly. It watches. And in its silence, it seems to suggest, look deeper. And so people do. They bring offerings, they chant old songs, they trace their fingers along weathered carvings that might be script or might be erosion. They light lamps at night, believing the hill contains spirits who remember a world before the waves. And maybe it does. Maybe the sea did take more than we know. Maybe Lemuria isn't real, but loss is. And Kumari Kandam, whether landmass or metaphor, speaks to something deeper than tectonics. It speaks to the idea that language, culture, and civilization can vanish without conquest. That a people can be so deeply rooted in oral tradition that when catastrophe comes, all that survives is a riddle wrapped in grief. And maybe that's why Kadathal Malai still feels heavy. Not physically, spiritually. Like it's mourning something it doesn't quite remember. Because what if the true collapse of a civilization isn't when the last building falls, but when the last meaning fails to be passed on? We tend to think in dates, empires, facts. But Kadathal Malai doesn't care about that. It's not here to prove anything. It's here to linger, to ask, to haunt. The Tamil language is one of the oldest still spoken. It survived colonization, globalization, digitization. But part of its soul lives on in ruins like Kadathal Malai. In unmarked stones. In unnamed grief. In the knowledge that something great was lost and that greatness doesn't need to be proven to be missed. Because some disappearances don't require disaster. Just the turning away of time. And now, let's return to the West. To the edge of the known world, where glaciers once ruled and myths still flicker in stone. A place not known for cities or pyramids but for stone circles, bone tools, and a mystery far older than agriculture. Angkor, the city that drowned in its own reflection. They called it the City of Temples, but that undersells the scale. Angkor wasn't just a city, it was a world. A metropolis spread across more than 400 square kilometers, with roads, canals, reservoirs, towers, bridge hydraulic precision stitched into jungle. It wasn't carved into a mountain. It built the mountain. And at its heart, Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed on Earth. Still standing. Still perfect. Still haunted. But the most unnerving thing about Angkor isn't its size. It's how it vanished. Not with a bang. Not from war. Not in conquest. But in a slow-motion drowning, one mistake at a time. Let's rewind. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire from the 9th to the 15th century CE, a time when Europe was choking on its own ignorance and the Khmer were building cities on water, not just near water, on it, around it, with it. They mastered hydraulic engineering, giant barrages, reservoirs, moats, canals, sluice gates designed not only to irrigate but to regulate spiritual harmony. Water wasn't just a resource. It was cosmic architecture. They built Angkor as a mandala in stone. Temples mirrored constellations. Towers aligned with solstices. The city was designed to reflect heaven, a terrestrial double of a divine blueprint. Angkor Wat, with its 5 lotus bud towers, is a symbolic model of Mount Maruth, center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. It's not a building, it's a cosmological machine. Every carving has a story. Every corridor has a direction. Every line is a law. And yet, for all its control, Angkor couldn't save itself. By the late 1300s, the empire was fraying. By the 1400s, it was gone. Not razed, not burned. Abandoned. Theories abound because of course they do. Some say it was climate change. Others blame the rise of Theravada Buddhism, which displaced the god-king ideology Angkor was built on. Still others cite warfare, Thai invasions from Ayutthaya. Or internal decay. Or hydraulic failure, a system so intricate that when it broke, the city couldn't survive its own collapse. And that's the metaphor that refuses to leave. The city drowned in its reflection. Angkor wasn't just a city on water. It was a city obsessed with balance, a spiritual, ecological, divine. But in trying to control every drop, they forgot something vital. Systems break. When the floods came, they overwhelmed the canals. When the droughts came, the reservoirs cracked. And when the spiritual authority of the kings collapsed, the temples became relics. The jungle moved back in. Slowly, gently, with vines instead of swords. By the time French explorers rediscovered Angkor in the 19th century, it was barely a rumor. Locals knew of it, of course. They left offerings, whispered stories. But to the Western world, it was a revelation. How could this have been built here? By them? It didn't fit the imperial narrative. So the same pattern played out. Doubt. Denial. Then appropriation. Some credited Indians, others the Chinese. A few lunatics floated the usual suspects: aliens, Atlanteans, ghost kings from lost continents. Because a civilization this sophisticated, this poetic, couldn't possibly have been Southeast Asian. But it was. And still is. Angkor is not a corpse. It's a sleeping body. Cambodia still carries its blood. In language, in art, in dance, in ritual. The temples are alive with visitors now. Tourists in cargo shorts walk the same steps kings once took in bare feet. Instagrammers snap selfies against bas-reliefs of apocalyptic churning oceans, unaware they're standing in a metaphor for the collapse of balance. Because Angkor didn't fall from laziness. It fell from perfection. From control stretched too tight. From reflection turned to obsession. And that's the moral. Sometimes, the most beautiful structures are the most fragile. Sometimes, a civilization builds heaven on earth and forgets how to live in it. The irony? The temples survived. The canals still work. The jungle returned what the empire tried to dominate. Angkor, the city that drowned in its own reflection. They called it the City of Temples, but that undersells the scale. Angkor wasn't just a city, it was a world. A metropolis spread across more than 400 square kilometers, with roads, canals, reservoirs, towers, bridge hydraulic precision stitched into jungle. It wasn't carved into a mountain. It built the mountain. And at its heart, Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed on Earth. Still standing. Still perfect. Still haunted. But the most unnerving thing about Angkor isn't its size. It's how it vanished. Not with a bang. Not from war. Not in conquest. But in a slow-motion drowning, one mistake at a time. Let's rewind. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire from the 9th to the 15th century CE, a time when Europe was choking on its own ignorance and the Khmer were building cities on water, not just near water, on it, around it, with it. They mastered hydraulic engineering, giant barrages, reservoirs, moats, canals, sluice gates designed not only to irrigate but to regulate spiritual harmony. Water wasn't just a resource. It was cosmic architecture. They built Angkor as a mandala in stone. Temples mirrored constellations. Towers aligned with solstices. The city was designed to reflect heaven, a terrestrial double of a divine blueprint. Angkor Wat, with its 5 lotus bud towers, is a symbolic model of Mount Maruth, center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. It's not a building, it's a cosmological machine. Every carving has a story. Every corridor has a direction. Every line is a law. And yet, for all its control, Angkor couldn't save itself. By the late 1300s, the empire was fraying. By the 1400s, it was gone. Not razed, not burned. Abandoned. Theories abound because of course they do. Some say it was climate change. Others blame the rise of Theravada Buddhism, which displaced the god-king ideology Angkor was built on. Still others cite warfare, Thai invasions from Ayutthaya. Or internal decay. Or hydraulic failure, a system so intricate that when it broke, the city couldn't survive its own collapse. And that's the metaphor that refuses to leave. The city drowned in its reflection. Angkor wasn't just a city on water. It was a city obsessed with balance, a spiritual, ecological, divine. But in trying to control every drop, they forgot something vital. Systems break. When the floods came, they overwhelmed the canals. When the droughts came, the reservoirs cracked. And when the spiritual authority of the kings collapsed, the temples became relics. The jungle moved back in. Slowly, gently, with vines instead of swords. By the time French explorers rediscovered Angkor in the 19th century, it was barely a rumor. Locals knew of it, of course. They left offerings, whispered stories. But to the Western world, it was a revelation. How could this have been built here? By them? It didn't fit the imperial narrative. So the same pattern played out. Doubt. Denial. Then appropriation. Some credited Indians, others the Chinese. A few lunatics floated the usual suspects: aliens, Atlanteans, ghost kings from lost continents. Because a civilization this sophisticated, this poetic, couldn't possibly have been Southeast Asian. But it was. And still is. Angkor is not a corpse. It's a sleeping body. Cambodia still carries its blood. In language, in art, in dance, in ritual. The temples are alive with visitors now. Tourists in cargo shorts walk the same steps kings once took in bare feet. Instagrammers snap selfies against bas-reliefs of apocalyptic churning oceans, unaware they're standing in a metaphor for the collapse of balance. Because Angkor didn't fall from laziness. It fell from perfection. From control stretched too tight. From reflection turned to obsession. And that's the moral. Sometimes, the most beautiful structures are the most fragile. Sometimes a civilization builds heaven on earth and forgets how to live in it. The irony? The temples survived. The canals still work. The jungle returned what the empire tried to dominate. The Wari Empire, the empire before empires. Long before the Inca carved Machu Picchu into the bones of the Andes, before they built their mountain-spanning highways and sun temples, there was someone else. Someone quieter, stranger, more organized, more vanished. They were called the Wari. And they may have invented the concept of empire in South America only to erase themselves from it before the final act. If you've never heard of the Wari, you're not alone. Most people skip straight to the Inca as if they appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, gold-plated, and sun-kissed. But the Inca didn't start from zero. They inherited, from someone, from this. The Wari rose around 600 CE and held power for almost 500 years. Their territory stretched across much of present-day paracoastal deserts, Andean highlands, jungle edges. Not an empire by conquest. An empire by infrastructure. Because the Wari didn't just build. They planned. They constructed administrative centers, road systems, urban grids, agricultural terraces. They developed water management systems in arid regions. They spread a state religion. And then they disappeared, so efficiently they took most of their name with them. Let's talk about Wari proper, the capital. At its peak, it may have housed over 40,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. But it wasn't a ceremonial space like Teotihuacan, it was a bureaucratic machine. Rectangular buildings, modular zones, warehouses, roads, complex waste management systems. The whole place feels like it was designed by an accountant with delusions of grandeur. They built compounds around courtyards walled off, segregated, tightly controlled. Elites lived apart. Artisans worked under supervision. Access to food, water, and movement, all regulated. This wasn't chaos. This was control. But what makes the Wari really disturbing isn't what they built. It's how little they cared about being remembered. Unlike the Inca, they didn't write epic histories. They didn't obsess over immortality. Their temples were practical. Their art was abstract. Their records, if they existed, they're gone. And then there's the burials. The Wari were big on ancestor veneration, storing mummies, rearranging bones, creating subterranean shrines for elite dead. Some were buried beneath the floorboards of homes. Others were placed in sealed tombs, heads removed and displayed. One site, recently uncovered near Lima, contained over 60 individuals carefully wrapped, ritually posed, entombed with ceramic guardians and miniature effigies. Whole families. And then, at some point, sealed off and forgotten. It's as if they didn't want to be remembered. They wanted to be preserved in secrecy. The collapse of the Wari, around 1000 CE, is almost surreal in its lack of explanation. No mass graves, no sign of war, just evacuation. Cities emptied. Infrastructure abandoned. Culture gone. The Inca rose about 400 years later. And guess what? They copied the roads. The administration centers. Even the idea of state religion. But they never mentioned the Wari by name. Because by then, the Wari weren't just dead. They were erased. Archaeologists are only now starting to put the puzzle together, and they hate how little there is to work with. What survives is fragmentary, textiles with haunting geometric faces. Ceramics depicting deities no one can name. Urban plans that feel eerily modern and disturbingly soulless. Some scholars suggest that the Wari collapsed due to over-centralization. Their control mechanisms were so rigid that once stress hit, drought, famine, descent, the whole thing shattered like brittle clay. But what if it wasn't collapse? What if it was retreat? What if the Wari, masters of systems, saw the system failing and simply walked away. They didn't destroy their cities. They didn't burn their temples. They just disappeared. Which brings us back to a pattern we've seen over and over. The most advanced civilizations don't go out in flames. They go out like a breath. Silent. Deliberate. Untraceable. Because some empires are built to last. Others are built to disappear so completely they become cautionary tales disguised as footnotes. And speaking of empires lost in the footnotes, let's go to East Africa. To a kingdom so advanced, it minted its own coins, carved obelisks taller than churches, and traded with Rome, India, and Byzantium. A civilization praised in the Bible. A city lost beneath dust and denial. Aksum, the empire that vanished into the stone. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, surrounded by mountains that crack the sky and clouds that move like secrets, there once stood a city of stone. Its kings minted gold coins stamped with crosses and crowns. Its merchants traded with Byzantium, Persia, and India. Its name appeared in Roman records, Islamic texts, and even the Hebrew Bible. And then, like a candle in wind, it was gone. This was Aksum. And it may be the most powerful empire you've never heard of. Let's rewind to the first few centuries of the Common Era. Rome was choking on decadence. Han China was imploding. India was fracturing into kingdoms. And in East Africa, Aksum was rising. From roughly 100 CE to 700 CE, Aksum controlled a territory stretching across modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, parts of Sudan, Djibouti, and Yemen. It wasn't just an African kingdom, it was a maritime superpower, ruling both sides of the Red Sea. Its capital, also called Aksumwas, a hub of trade, diplomacy, religion, and something much harder to explain: permanence. Because Aksum didn't just build cities. It built monuments that refused to fall. The stelae of Aksum are some of the most eerie, majestic, and completely unexplainable constructions in all of antiquity. Towering obelisks, some over 30 meters tall, carved from single pieces of granite, decorated with false doors and windows like stone skyscrapers from a parallel timeline. One was so massive, it likely collapsed during installation. Another was stolen by Mussolini's troops in the 1930s and returned only recently. These weren't tomb markers. They were statements. Of power. Of legacy. Of something spiritual we no longer understand. Because we don't know how they moved them. Or why they stopped. The kings of Aksum ruled with divine authority. Inscriptions describe them as conquerors, but also as architects of order-bringing, irrigation, law, religion. They were among the first sub-Saharan rulers to adopt Christianity, around 330 CE, long before most of Europe got the memo. They even built churches with stone crossbeams still standing today, untouched by time or war. Aksum minted its own coins: gold, silver, bronze, inscribed in Greek and later in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian script. These coins made their way as far as India and Rome. They were small, round ambassadors of a civilization confident in its place in the world. But the place changed. By the 7th century, something began to shift. Trade routes that had once fed Aksum's ports now flowed through Islamic states. The Red Sea became a hostile border. Internal power began to fragment. The climate shifted: droughts, soil depletion, over-farming. Aksum began to shrink. Not catastrophically. Just incrementally. Like an empire realizing its time was over. By the 10th century, the capital had moved to the highlands. By the 12th, the old city was mostly abandoned. By the time European explorers arrived centuries later, all that was left were the obelisks, the church ruins, the coin fragments, and a people who remembered pieces. But the full story? Gone. There are no detailed Aksumite chronicles, no surviving libraries. Most of what we know comes from outsiders: Greeks, Romans, Persians, or from fragment stone inscriptions that speak like telegrams from ghosts. Aksum had its own written languages, but it wasn't used to write down history the way the Romans did. It was used to encode ritual, liturgy, God, not government. And that silence opened a vacuum colonialists were only too happy to fill. For years, historians dismissed Aksum as myth. They couldn't believe an African empire had reached so far, built so high, or existed so early. They assumed the obelisks were foreign. The coins were imported. The architecture was influenced. Because the idea that Africans could have done this themselves, that was the real mystery. But here's the truth. Aksum was real. It was powerful. It was complex. And it was deliberately unpreserved. Because the Aksumites didn't build to be remembered. They built to be sacred. And when the sacred turned silent, they let it go. Today, the town of Aksum is quiet. The obelisks still rise. The old tombs still echo. And the churches, some of them still function. Still whisper prayers in the ancient tongue. Tourists come and leave. Archaeologists scratch the surface. Locals walk among the ruins like they're part of the air. Because maybe they are. Maybe some civilizations never vanish. They just fold into myth so perfectly, so seamlessly, you stop seeing them as fact. You start seeing them as inevitable. But they weren't. Aksum rose. Aksum ruled. Aksum fell. And left a city made of stone. And questions made of silence. And now we head east. To a city buried in jungle, not legend. A place where language flourished and then shut itself down. Where temples were so precise, they rivaled computers. Where calendars predicted eclipses and endings. And then, the ending came. The Maya collapse, the civilization that predicted its own vanishing. It didn't happen all at once. There was no volcanic apocalypse, no sweeping invasion, no single final battle written in blood. The Maya didn't vanish in a moment. They vanished in chapters. In pauses. In gasps. In a silence that stretched over a century so slowly that even the stars might have missed it. And yet, somehow, they knew it was coming. You've heard the myth that the Maya predicted the end of the world in 2012. A pop culture punchline built from a misunderstanding of an ancient calendar. The truth? Far more unsettling. Because the Maya didn't predict the end of the world. They predicted endings, repeatedly. Cycles of rise and fall. Of kings, of cities, of civilizations. Including their own. Let's go back. Way back. The Maya civilization flourished across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. From around 2000 BCE to the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s, they built one of the most advanced and enigmatic cultures in human history. At their peak classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, they carved cities out of rainforest. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, Caracol. Temples, observatories, ball courts, pyramids. They didn't just stack stones, they engineered cosmic theaters. The Maya understood time better than most modern people. They didn't see it as linear. They saw it as layered, recursive, symbolic. Their long count calendar tracked dates across thousands of years. They calculated lunar cycles, eclipses, planetary movements with an accuracy NASA still respects. They wrote in glyphs of the few fully developed writing systems of the ancient Americas. They recorded history, astronomy, war, royal births, deaths, cosmic alignments. Their temples are textbooks made of stone. But sometime around 800 CE, something began to change. Cities were suddenly abandoned. Temples were left half-finished. Elite monuments stopped being carved. Stelathos' towering historical markers fell silent. This was the classic Maya collapse. And no one really agrees why it happened. Some cities, like Tikal and Copan, declined rapidly. Others, like Chichen Itza in the north, flourished much later. There was no single timeline, no singular fall. Just a wave of disappearances rolling from south to north. So what caused it? Pick your poison. Climate change? The evidence is terreediment cores suggest a series of massive droughts between 800 and 1000 CE. Overpopulation? Many Maya cities had densities rivaling modern urban sprawl, which would have put intense pressure on agriculture and water supply. 2. Political collapse? Cities warred constantly, forging and breaking alliances, betraying kin, overthrowing kings. When the gods stopped answering, so did the armies. Environmental exhaustion, deforestation, slash-and-burn farming, and land degradation could have hollowed out the ecosystem from the inside. Spiritual crisis. When rituals no longer worked, when kings failed to summon rain, when temples stood empty, faith may have cracked like stone under heat. And here's the strangest theory. They saw it coming. Inscriptions from the late Classic period grow increasingly apocalyptic. Some monuments reference endings, not of time itself, but of cycles, cities, dynasties. The word chahom appears meaning collapse, break, or release. As if the Maya understood they were approaching a threshold. Not the end, just a turning. Some scholars even believe the Maya elites, steeped in their cyclical worldview, may have interpreted the collapse not as failure, but as cosmic inevitability. A necessary sacrifice. A divine punctuation mark. In that way, the Maya didn't just fail. They followed through. Which is worse? Here's what makes the collapse so eerie. The Maya left everything behind. And almost nothing at all. The cities still stand, at least their skeletons do. The temples are intact. The glyphs still whisper. But the meaning? Fragmented. Mangled. Missing. It took centuries before we even began to decipher their writing. Many of the codice-folding books of bark paper were burned by Spanish priests who declared them heresy. Only 4 survived. An entire civilization's philosophy, its science, its calendar, its soul reduced to 4 books. Written in symbols we only started to understand after the moon landing. And yet the Maya didn't die. Their descendants are still here. In Chiapas, in Guatemala, in Yucatan. They still speak Maya languages. Still honor the gods, in secret or in syncretism. Still walk among the ruins of their ancestors, carrying bloodlines deeper than limestone. The Maya didn't vanish. They contracted. Like a breath held in memory. Like a prophecy only they were willing to believe. And maybe, in a darkly ironic twist, they were right. Because what if the Maya collapse wasn't a collapse at all? What if it was a reset? A strategic withdrawal from a pattern that had run its course? We keep looking for disaster when the answer might be deliberate dissolution. And that brings us, naturally, to a place much colder. Much newer. But equally unsettling. A remote island where an entire Viking colony vanished not in battle, not in disease, but in abandonment. Where graves still sit beneath frost. Where churches outlasted the people who built them. Where the silence of snow sounds exactly like a civilization being forgotten. The Norse of Greenland, the colony that froze its own future. There's cold, and then there's Greenland cold. The kind that doesn't just numb your skin, it compresses time. The kind of cold that preserves bone but erases context. The kind where even memory gets frostbite. And somewhere beneath that permafrost, scattered across the fjords and valleys of Greenland's southern edge, lie the remains of a people who should have thrived and instead simply stopped. No final battle. No invading horde. No volcanic eruption. Just a quiet glacial exit. This was the Norse colony of Greenland, founded by Eric the Red in the late 10th century, a Viking outpost turned Christian commonwealth, sustained for nearly 500 years. Until it wasn't. And the worst part? They saw it coming. And did nothing. Let's rewind to 985 CE. Eric the Red, fresh off an exile from Iceland, because Viking drama is never subtle, sets sail west and finds a massive, icy landmass, Greenland. He names it strategically. Greenland sounded much more appealing than endless icy Death Island, and returns to Iceland to recruit settlers. A few hundred follow him. They establish two main settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, names as exciting as a tax ledger. They bring cattle, sheep, pigs. They build longhouses, churches, farms. They write sagas. They plant roots. And for a while, it works. At its peak, the colony may have housed over 5,000 people. They traded with Europolris ivory, sealskins, even polar bear hides. They sent bishops to Rome. They built cathedrals out of imported timber and native stone. They were on the map. But maps lie. Because beneath that surface of piety and self-sufficiency, the Norse Greenlanders were playing a very dangerous game, pretending Greenland was just like Norway. Just colder. Just a bit more challenging. But Greenland isn't Norway. Its soil is thinner. Its summers are shorter. Its resources more fragile. Its climate, well, escalating. By the 1300s, the Little Ice Age had begun an extended period of cooling that hit Greenland like a divine eviction notice. Harvests failed. Livestock starved. Drift ice blocked ships. The last known contact with Europe was in the early 1400s. After that, silence. The Western settlement vanished first. By the mid-1300s, it was completely abandoned. The Eastern settlement lingered another century. And then, nothing. When Danish missionaries arrived in the 1700s, they found ruins. Stone churches filled with snow. Collapsed barns. Skeletons buried properly, but without continuity. No survivors. No stories. Just a frozen question mark. So, what happened? Again, pick your poison. Climate collapse? Definitely. The cooling climate shortened growing seasons, killed pasture, and made sea travel almost impossible. Economic isolation? European trade shifted. The market for walrus ivory collapsed. Greenland became irrelevant. Cultural rigidity? Probably the most damning. The Norse refused to adapt. They clung to cattle-based agriculture even as their livestock starved. They ignored Inuit hunting techniques. They wouldn't eat seal until it was too late. They were Vikings who refused to go full Viking. And then there's the archaeological smoking gun. The last farm sites show increasingly poor nutrition, smaller livestock, more signs of desperation. And the final graves? Frozen in soil, still Christian, still proud, buried as if they were going to church next Sunday. They died pretending nothing was wrong. No signs of violence. No mass graves. Just disappearance. This is perhaps what makes the Norse Greenlanders so haunting. They had every warning sign. They had alternatives, Inuit neighbors who survived the same conditions. But they refused to adapt. They chose familiarity over survival. And in doing so, they became a lesson written in snow. Even today, the ruins remain. The church at Halcyone, of the best-preserved Norse ruins in Greenland, still stands. Stone walls, arched doorways, a place made to last. And inside, silence. It was here, in 1408, that the last written record from Norse Greenland was Medea wedding. Think about that. The final official act of a dying civilization was a marriage. A promise made in a freezing cathedral, with no food, no future, no ships on the horizon. And then, nothing. No one knows what happened to the last families. Did they starve? Leave? Intermarry with the Inuit and disappear into genetic memory? No sagas tell the tale. Because sometimes collapse doesn't get a storyteller. It just gets frostbite. And so the Norse of Greenland become another chapter in our growing list. A people who were smart, sophisticated, connected, and still failed. Not because they were weak, but because they were stubborn, because they thought tradition could outlast temperature, because they believed civilization was a fortress, not a tent in the wind. And speaking of tents in the wind, let's go now to the steppe. To the vast, empty spaces where empires flickered like candlelight. Where warriors built cities not of stone, but memory. Where a whole civilization rose, traded, ruled, and then became a rumor. The Xiongnu. You've heard of the Huns. You've heard of the Mongols. But before both, before Attila, before Genghis, there was a name that echoed across Asia like a storm in waiting. Xiongnu. And for a while, they were the boogeymen of the Han dynasty. The invisible empire. The enemy with no city. The horse lords who didn't just ride the steppe. They were the steppe. They lived in motion. Fought like ghosts. And then, when they vanished, they left behind almost nothing. Just a strange, unsettling question. Who the hell were they? Let's set the stage. Around the 3rd century BCE, a confederation of nomadic tribes coalesced in what is now Mongolia. They were not farmers, not city builders. They were herders, archers, raiders. And they were fast. By 209 BCE, under the leadership of Modu Chanyu, the Xiongnu had formed the first true empire on the Eurasian steppe that could rival, harass, and even extort China. Yes, extort. The Han dynasty literally paid them off. With silk, gold, princesses. In exchange for not being pillaged that year. This wasn't weakness, it was policy. Because the Xiongnu weren't a scattered group of barbarians. They were a machine. A mobile, multi-ethnic confederacy. With a warrior aristocracy, a chain of vassal kings, and a communication network that moved faster than any imperial courier. Their lifestyle was alien to the Chinese court. No palaces. No fortresses. Just felt tense, shifting pastures, and untraceable revenge. And so, in typical bureaucratic fashion, the Han did what terrified states always do. They built a wall. A very long wall. One that later emperors would expand into the Great Wall of China. Because of the Xiongnu. That's right. The Great Wall wasn't built for some poetic metaphor. It was a panic project. A hedge against the shadow empire to the north. But walls are for people who stay still. And the Xiongnu didn't. They raided. They retreated. They demanded tribute. They married into courts. They ambushed supply lines. They melted into the horizon. And they terrified everyone. Because how do you fight an empire with no center? Eventually, the Han got sick of being hustled and launched counter-campaigns. For a while, they worked. Han generals pushed north, took territory, turned rival tribes. By the 1st century CE, the Xiongnu Confederation began to splinter. Civil war, factions, defections. Some Xiongnu joined the Han. Others vanished into the steppes. Others moved west farther west than anyone expected. And here's where the mystery deepens. Because a few centuries later, a new group shows up in Europe. They don't farm. They don't write. They ride fast. They fight dirty. They come out of nowhere and leave nothing but ashes. They're called the Huns. And some historians whisper, what if the Huns were the Xiongnu? It's speculative. Linguistic threads, genetic shadows, cultural echoes. But it's enough to keep the theory alive. Because the Roman sources, when describing the Huns, use the same tone the Han used for the Xiongnu. Terror-struck resignation. They arrive. They devastate. They disappear. And you have no idea what they want. But here's the twist. Despite all the fear, despite all the imperial treaties, military campaigns, and terrified chroniclers, we know almost nothing about the Xiongnu themselves. They left no written record of their own. No epic inscriptions. No stelae boasting of their victories. No central capital in stone. They were oral, nomadic, modular. Their tombs those we found are rich with grave goods. Bronze mirrors, gold jewelry, horse trappings. But the identity of the buried, obscure. No names carved in eternity. Just bones and questions. Even their exact language is unknown. Proto-Turkic, Proto-Mongolic, something else entirely. We don't know. Because they didn't write it down. Or if they did, it's gone. Which makes them feel less like a civilization and more like a force of nature. A gust of wind that flattened dynasties. A shadow cast by hooves over history's brittle timeline. A reminder that not every empire leaves ruins. Some leave only reactions. And in that way, the Xiongnu may have been the most modern of ancient civilizations. Their power wasn't static. It was relational. They didn't rule with monuments. They ruled with momentum. They weren't building legacies. They were building uncertainty. And when their time was done, they didn't collapse. They migrated into myth. Because the steppe doesn't remember you with statues. It remembers you with fear. And that brings us to a different kind of fear. Not the nomadic kind. Not the icy kind. Not the ghost of empire kind. But the kind that whispers. What if there was a city so advanced, so perfect, so spiritual, that even its own people couldn't live up to it? Mohenjo-Daro, the city that forgot what it was for. It doesn't look like much at first. Just crumbling brick walls. Straight streets choked with dust. An old bath. A broken well. A silence that clings to everything like the scent of something once alive. This is Mohenjo-Daro, the crown jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. Once a city of order, symmetry, and cleanliness. Now a riddle made of baked mud and vanished purpose. Let's start with the facts we do know. Mohenjo-Daro was built around 2600 BCE in what is today southern Pakistan. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, part of the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, which spanned over 1 million square kilometers and housed upward of 5 million people at its peak. That's bigger than ancient Egypt. Bigger than Mesopotamia. And yet most people can't name a single Indus king. Because here's the catch. They had no palaces. No pyramids. No monuments to ego. No clear evidence of war. No royal tombs. And no writing system we can read. Just cities so clean they'd make modern urban planners weep. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't a city. It was a blueprint. Its streets were laid out on a precise north-south grid. Homes had indoor plumbing. Multi-room dwellings. Septic systems. The world's first known flush toilets. And at the center of it all, the most iconic feature. The Great Bath. A massive public bathing structure made from carefully fitted bricks, sealed with bitumen, complete with inlets and drains. It wasn't just for hygiene, it was ritual. A purification site. A spiritual heartbeat. The spiritual before the spectacular. The people of Mohenjo-Daro seemed less interested in worshipping gods with gold and more focused on keeping their water clean. Which raises a question. What kind of civilization prioritizes sanitation over spectacle? Whatever they were, the Harappans were obsessed with order. Uniform brick sizes across the region. Standardized weights and measures. Carefully controlled trade goods. They traded with Mesopotamia, with coastal cities, possibly even with Egypt. Their seal-scarved stone stamps used for trade or identification feature strange animals, composite beasts, and an undeciphered script. That script? Still unbroken. Over 4,000 examples found. None translated. Why? Because it's not alphabetic. Not syllabic. Possibly not even linguistic in the way we understand language. It may be a proto-writing system, a set of ritual symbols meant to be understood by insiders and no one else. Which means that unless we find a bilingual Rosetta Stone, the Indus script may stay silent forever. And that silence is deafening. Because it's not just that we don't know what the Harappans believed. It's that we don't even know if they had gods. There are no temples. No idols. Just small figurines, some female, some animal, some horned, some seated in yoga-like poses. Hints. Echoes. Never declarations. No conquest narratives. No murals of battles. No divine kings parading through eternity. It's like they didn't want to be remembered the way other empires did. And then, somewhere around 1900 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro and the rest of the Indus Valley cities began to decline. The streets cracked. The drains clogged. The bricks stopped matching. And finally, people left. Not all at once. Not in terror. In drift. So what happened? Once again, choose your apocalypse. River shift. The Indus and its tributaries were unpredictable. If the rivers moved, the cities lost their lifelines. Climate change. There's evidence of drought, soil salinity, environmental strain. Overextended trade networks, resource scarcity, internal stagnation. Cultural fatigue. A civilization built on balance may not know what to do with disruption. And then, there's the absence of violence. That's the strange part. You'd expect to find signs of war-burned layers, mass graves, defensive walls. But there's almost nothing. Just a few scattered skeletons. Unburied. Some face down in the street. As if they fell and no one came back for them. Archaeologists once thought Mohenjo-Daro ended in massacre. But later studies disprove that. No mass killings, no siege. Just abandonment. And now it sits in ruin. The Great Bath is dry. The grid is crumbling. The order is broken. And we don't even know what they called it. Mohenjo-Daro means Mound of the Dead, a name given by modern locals, not ancient architects. So here's the real question. What kind of civilization builds a nearly utopian city clean, efficient, peaceful, interconnected, and forgets to leave a message? Was it humility? Or hubris? Did they think they'd last forever? Or did they believe their work would speak for them? It did. But we don't understand the language. And that's the final irony. They may have built one of the most advanced cities in the ancient world. And it didn't matter. Because when the rivers moved, and the script was forgotten, and the bath dried up, no one remembered what it was all for. Which brings us, finally, to one last question. Not who built it. Not why did they vanish. But what if vanishing was the plan? Some civilizations build for eternity. Others build for a moment. And some, like Mohenjo-Daro, build something so perfect, so symmetrical, so without ego, that when the time comes to leave, they don't burn it. They don't bury it. They just forget. And someone thousands of years later stares at the bricks and asks, was this a city or a mirror? And now we come full circle. Mohenjo-Daro joins the others in our story Göbekli Tepe, Teotihuacan, Great Zimbabwe, Cahokia. Each vanished, each brilliant, each refusing to leave behind a clean explanation. Because maybe the point isn't what we lost. Maybe the point is that we still don't understand what we're looking at. These were civilizations that didn't just die. They withdrew. Like a tide. Like a breath. Like a lesson you weren't ready to learn yet. And so they wait. In stone, in silence. In questions shaped like cities. Because the greatest mystery isn't why they vanished. It's why we keep doing the same thing. Over and over. Building, forgetting, collapsing, repeating. And maybe that's the final warning. The past didn't vanish. It's watching. Now. Always. From under the sand. From under the sea. From under your feet. Whispering. You will vanish too. And no one will remember the name you gave your temples. Only the silence you left behind. Only the mystery. Only the question. Fade to black. End.